Picture this: a Roman emperor fighting as a gladiator in the Colosseum, convinced he's the reincarnation of Hercules. Another emperor tries to make his horse a government official. And one poor guy gets assassinated while literally taking a bathroom break during a war campaign. Welcome to the wildest political story ever told, the complete saga of all 80 Roman emperors who ruled for over 500 years. We're talking about the ultimate mix of military genius and spectacular madness, family drama that makes reality TV look tame, and enough backstabbing to fuel 1,000 Netflix series. From Augustus, who built the greatest empire in history, to little Romulus Augustulus, who watched it all crumble. Each of these rulers shaped our world in ways we still feel today. So hit subscribe if you're ready for the craziest history lesson you've ever heard. And let's dive into 5 centuries of absolute power, absolute corruption, and absolutely unforgettable characters.
Let's kick things off with the man who started it all, Emperor number 1, Augustus. This political genius ruled for an incredible 45 years, from 27 BCE to 14 CE, taking power at just 18 years old and holding on to it until his death at 75. He transformed Rome from a war-torn republic into the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and somehow made it look easy. Born just plain old Gaius Octavius, he was only a teenager when his great-uncle Julius Caesar got stabbed to death in the Senate. Caesar left him everything in his will: his name, his money, and a whole lot of enemies who really didn't want some kid running around claiming to be the new Caesar. But this wasn't your average teenager. He outmaneuvered seasoned politicians like Mark Antony and Lepidus, proving that sometimes youth and cunning beat experience and muscles. His masterpiece was the sea battle at Actium in 31 BCE, where he defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra in what was basically the ancient world's version of a superhero showdown. This victory ended the Roman Republic forever and began the Empire. Augustus spent decades carefully building what he called the Principate, keeping all the old Republican offices around like decorations, while he held all the real power behind the scenes. The guy was a master of political theater. He claimed he wanted to give power back to the people while quietly making sure he controlled the army, the money, and basically everything that mattered. He rebuilt Rome's infrastructure, created the world's first professional police and fire departments, and established a system of government that would run the Mediterranean world for centuries. Augustus died peacefully in 14 CE, allegedly joking, "Have I played the part well? Then give me your applause as I exit," though this was probably too perfect to be true. His 45-year reign created the Pax Romana, 2 centuries of relative peace and prosperity that people still talk about today. The man who claimed to have found Rome made of brick and left it made of marble had done something even more impressive. He'd created a system of government that could survive his death and keep running the world.
After Augustus's brilliant performance, next up is Emperor number 2, Tiberius, the guy who really didn't want the job. This reluctant ruler took power at age 54 in 14 CE and spent the next 23 years on the throne until his death at 77, making him the poster child for ancient Rome's most successful case of fake it till you make it. Tiberius was Augustus's stepson, who got stuck with the job after all the emperor's preferred heirs died young, which happened suspiciously often in Roman families. He was actually a brilliant military commander who had conquered parts of Germany, but he had all the charisma of wet cardboard and the personality of someone who'd rather be literally anywhere else. Think of him as that
incapable co-worker who gets promoted to manager and spends every day wishing they could go back to their old job. His early reign was actually pretty competent. He balanced the budget, kept the borders secure, and didn't start any unnecessary wars. But then things got weird. In 26 CE, he basically rage quit Rome and moved to the island of Capri, running the empire through strongly worded letters while reportedly indulging in activities that Roman historians had very colorful imaginations about. Back in Rome, his absence created a power vacuum that the ambitious Praetorian prefect, Sejanus, tried to fill by basically staging a slow-motion coup. When Tiberius finally figured out what was happening, he had Sejanus executed along with his entire family and most of his supporters. This purge made him even more paranoid and isolated, turning his later years into a reign of terror conducted by mail. When he finally died in 37 CE, possibly smothered by the Praetorian prefect who got tired of waiting, Romans literally celebrated in the streets. They chanted, "Tiberius to the Tiber," wanting to throw his body in the river like garbage. Harsh? Maybe, but this reaction showed how his later years of paranoid rule had completely destroyed the goodwill Augustus had built up. Despite being wildly unpopular, Tiberius left the empire richer and more secure than he'd found it. Sometimes the best rulers really are the ones who least want the job. But his death would bring to power someone who definitely did want to be emperor, and that would be a very different kind of problem.
From the guy who hated being emperor to someone who loved it way too much, meet Emperor number 3, Caligula. This certified lunatic took power at just 24 years old in 37 CE and packed enough crazy into less than 4 years to earn a permanent spot in history's Hall of Fame for imperial insanity until his assassination at age 28 in 41 CE. Born Gaius Caesar, he got the nickname Caligula, Little Boot, as a toddler when he wore tiny military deer around his father's army camps. The soldiers thought it was adorable. They wouldn't have been so amused if they'd known this cute kid would grow up to declare himself a living god and allegedly try to make his horse a government official. At first, Romans were thrilled to have someone young and energetic after Tiberius's gloomy final years. Caligula released political prisoners, put on amazing games, and generally acted like the fun emperor everyone wanted. But then his behavior went completely off the rails. He started demanding to be worshipped as a god, built a temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples just so he could ride across it in triumph, and once made senators run alongside his chariot for miles in their formal robes just because he could. The guy burned through money like it was going out of style, bankrupting the treasury on pointless construction projects and increasingly bizarre spectacles. He'd force audiences to watch him perform and had guards prevent anyone from leaving during his concerts. Imagine being trapped in a karaoke session with an armed crazy person who thinks they're the next Elvis. His reign of terror ended abruptly in 41 CE when a group of Praetorian guards led by Cassius Caria cornered him in a palace hallway and stabbed him to death. The conspiracy involved multiple senators who'd simply had enough of his unpredictable cruelty and megalomaniacal demands for divine worship. Caligula proved that absolute power plus mental instability equals disaster for everyone involved. His death left Romans wondering if maybe this whole emperor thing was a terrible idea. But they were about to discover that sometimes the most unlikely candidates make the best leaders.
After the Caligula disaster, here comes the most unlikely emperor of all. Number 4, Claudius. This stuttering, limping scholar became emperor at age 50 in 41 CE and ruled for 13 years until his death at 63, proving that sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly who you need in charge. Claudius was Caligula's uncle, a guy everyone in the imperial family dismissed as the weird bookworm with physical disabilities, who spent his time writing histories that nobody read. When the Praetorian Guards went on their killing spree and murdered Caligula, they found Claudius hiding behind some curtains in the palace, probably hoping everyone would forget he existed. Instead, they declared him emperor almost as a joke. He was the last adult male in the family, so why not? Turns out the joke was on everyone else. This simple-minded scholar conquered Britain in 43 CE, finally finishing what Julius Caesar had started a century earlier. He didn't just send armies, he personally sailed to Britain and led the victory parade, showing that all those years reading military histories had actually taught him something about warfare. Claudius also revolutionized Roman society by expanding citizenship, building incredible infrastructure projects like new aqueducts and the harbor at Ostia, and reforming the legal system with an efficiency that made previous emperors look like amateurs. He proved that sometimes having a disability means you work twice as hard to be twice as good. His personal life was less successful than his public achievements. His third wife, Messalina, was executed for essentially committing treason by marrying someone else while still married to the emperor, which was either incredibly stupid or incredibly bold. His fourth wife, Agrippina, allegedly poisoned him with mushrooms in 54 CE, reportedly leading Claudius to joke that mushrooms were the food of the gods, since they made him one. The emperor, who everyone thought was too weak to rule, had transformed Britain from a collection of Celtic tribes into a Roman province, expanded the empire's boundaries, and shown that intellectual curiosity could be just as valuable as military glory. But his death would bring his stepson Nero to power, and that kid had some very different ideas about what emperors should do with their time. From the scholarly Claudius to history's most infamous performer-emperor, meet number 5, Nero. This walking disaster became emperor at just 16 years old in 54 CE and spent the next 14 years turning imperial politics into deadly theater before his suicide at age 30 in 68 CE. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, Nero became emperor through his mother Agrippina's marriage to Claudius and some suspicious mushroom-related incidents. Initially guided by the philosopher Seneca and Praetorian prefect Burrus, young Nero actually showed promise, until power, paranoia, and a serious case of artistic delusions corrupted him completely. His greatest hits include murdering his mother Agrippina after multiple failed attempts involving a collapsing boat that she survived by swimming to shore, executing his first wife Octavia to marry his mistress Poppaea, and the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. While he probably didn't fiddle during the fire, fiddles hadn't been invented yet. He definitely used the disaster as an excuse to build his massive Golden House palace, leading to rumors that he'd started the blaze himself. But Nero's real passion was performing. He forced audiences to watch him sing, act, and recite poetry, with guards making sure nobody could leave during his interminable concerts. He competed in the Olympics and won every single event he entered, including a chariot race where he fell out of his chariot and didn't even finish. Apparently,
Being emperor meant never having to actually win to get first place. His downfall came through military rebellions across the empire, triggered by his completely delusional belief that he was an artist first and emperor second. When reality finally caught up with him in 68 CE, he committed suicide while allegedly lamenting, "What an artist dies in me," which is probably the most Nero thing he could have said. His death triggered the year of 4 emperors as the empire descended into civil war over who would replace him. Nero had proven that individual incompetence really could destroy decades of careful institution building, and now everyone with an army was about to try their hand at being emperor.
Enter the first casualty of the post-Nero chaos, Emperor number 6, Galba. This elderly senator took power at age 73 in June 68 CE and managed to get himself killed just 7 months later in January 69 CE, proving that sometimes being first to rebel doesn't guarantee lasting success. Galba was a provincial governor in Spain who declared himself emperor after Nero's suicide, marching on Rome with promises to restore fiscal responsibility and moral order after years of Neronian excess. At 73, he was one of the oldest people ever to become emperor. Imagine your grandfather suddenly deciding he wanted to run a global superpower. He had decades of military experience and a reputation for strict discipline, which sounded great in theory. Unfortunately, his idea of fiscal responsibility meant refusing to pay the Praetorian Guards their promised bonuses, and his version of moral order involved harsh punishments that quickly made him more enemies than Nero had ever managed. His policies were probably necessary, but he had the political skills of a sledgehammer and the charm of a tax audit. The defining moment came when he passed over Otho, a former friend of Nero's, for adoption and succession, choosing instead some random guy named Piso. This decision royally ticked off Otho, who had been sucking up to Galba for months, expecting to be chosen as heir. Hell hath no fury like a Roman politician scorned. His death in January 69 CE was as undignified as his reign had been unsuccessful. Otho's supporters murdered him in the Roman Forum and paraded his severed head around on a pike. The old man's attempts at good government had been undone by his complete inability to manage the basic politics of keeping people happy. Galba's brief reign launched the chaotic year of 4 emperors, proving that good intentions and military experience meant nothing if you couldn't master the art of not making everyone want to kill you. His death brought Otho to power, the same guy whose hurt feelings had started this whole mess.
From Galba's political victim to emperor himself, here's number 7, Otho. This former party boy ruled for exactly 3 months, from January to April 69 CE, making him one of history's shortest reigning emperors, but also one of its most surprisingly honorable, until his suicide at age 37. Marcus Salvius Otho had been Nero's drinking buddy and rival for Poppaea's affections before Nero married her and sent Otho off to govern Portugal as punishment for being too charming. When Galba passed him over for succession, Otho orchestrated the old emperor's assassination, figuring if he couldn't inherit power legally, he'd just take it by force. At 37, Otho seemed perfectly suited for the game of imperial politics and survival. He had connections, charisma, and enough ambition to murder his way to the throne. But his reign immediately faced a massive problem. The Rhine legions had proclaimed their own emperor,
Vitellius, and were marching toward Italy with veteran troops who'd been fighting Germans for years. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Bedriacum, where Otho's hastily assembled forces got absolutely crushed by Vitellius's experienced Germanic legions. This should have been the setup for a prolonged civil war, as Otho retreated, regrouped, and fought back with everything he had. Instead, Otho did something that shocked everyone. He committed suicide rather than drag the empire through more civil war. His suicide note reportedly said he wouldn't cause more suffering for Rome just to keep himself in power, which was either genuine nobility or the ultimate guilt trip, depending on how cynical you want to be. Romans were genuinely surprised by Otho's honorable death. Here was a guy who'd seemed like just another ambitious politician, but when it mattered, he chose the empire's welfare over his own survival. His death meant Vitellius could take power without more fighting. But would the new emperor prove worthy of Otho's sacrifice?
Meet the emperor who literally ate his way through the treasury. Number 8, Vitellius. This professional glutton ruled for 8 months from April to December 69 CE, distinguishing himself mainly through legendary food consumption and poor decision-making, before his gruesome death at age 54. Aulus Vitellius was a career politician whose main qualifications were his father's court connections and his own talent for flattery rather than actual leadership skills. The Rhine legions proclaimed him emperor not because he was brilliant, but because he happened to be their governor when they decided they were tired of being ruled by people who'd never seen a real battle. His reign's most memorable feature wasn't military success or administrative reform. It was his eating habits. Ancient sources claim Vitellius consumed 4 huge feasts every day, invented exotic dishes that cost fortunes, and basically turned running the empire into an extended dinner party. He allegedly spent more on food in 8 months than most emperors spent on public works projects in years. While Vitellius was literally eating Rome into bankruptcy, another problem was brewing in the east. Vespasian's legions, fresh from crushing the Jewish revolt, decided they'd rather have a competent military commander as emperor than someone whose greatest achievement was creating a new type of expensive fish sauce. The end came in December 69 CE, when Vespasian's forces crushed Vitellius's armies at the Battle of Cremona. The final insult was that Vitellius was dragged from his hiding place in the palace, tortured by Roman mobs, and killed in the streets before his body was thrown into the Tiber River. A particularly undignified end, even by Roman standards. Vitellius had proven that military backing without personal competence was useless during civil wars. His death finally brought a competent general to power, someone who understood that running an empire required more than just knowing which wine went best with roasted peacock.
Finally, some actual competence. Meet Emperor number 9, Vespasian, who took power at age 60 in 69 CE and spent the next 10 years, until his death at 69, cleaning up the mess left by the year of 4 emperors and proving that sometimes the empire really did need a practical middle-class guy in charge. Vespasian came from a middle-class family in small-town Italy. His father was a tax collector, which was about as unglamorous as Roman careers got. But this provincial nobody had earned his position through decades of faithful military service, most recently crushing the Jewish revolt while other people were fighting over who got to wear the purple in Rome. His practical achievements were exactly what the empire needed. He restored imperial finances through new taxes, including his famous tax on public toilets. "Money has no smell," he reportedly said. Started construction of the Colosseum to give Romans better entertainment than civil wars, and established stable succession by training his sons Titus and Domitian to help him govern. Vespasian was the first emperor from outside the traditional Roman aristocracy, proving that merit could be more important than fancy family trees. His policies were often unpopular, but always effective. He prioritized long-term stability over short-term popularity, which was exactly the opposite of what his predecessors had done. He died naturally in 79 CE, reportedly joking, "I think I'm becoming a god," as he felt death approaching. Romans believed emperors became divine after death, so this was actually pretty funny by ancient standards. His 10-year reign had transformed the empire from chaos back to order through simple competence and hard work. The man who'd risen from tax collector's son to emperor had proven that Rome's greatest strength was its ability to elevate talent regardless of background. His death would pass power to his son Titus, who had already proven himself as a military commander. But would he be able to handle the challenges waiting for him?
From the practical father to the beloved son, here's Emperor number 10, Titus. This popular military hero became emperor at age 39 in 79 CE, but only got to rule for 2 short years before his death at 41, earning the nickname Delight of the Human Race, despite his tragically brief reign. Titus had already proven himself as a military commander by capturing Jerusalem in 70 CE during the Jewish War, bringing massive wealth back to Rome and establishing his reputation as someone who could actually win battles. His relationship with Jewish Queen Berenice had caused some scandal. Romans worried he might marry her and create a foreign influence problem. But his military success made people overlook his complicated love life. His brief reign faced immediate disasters that would have broken lesser leaders. Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum under tons of ash, while fires and plague hit Rome itself. Instead of hiding in his palace, Titus personally supervised relief efforts, opened his own home to refugees, and spent imperial money freely to help disaster victims. The crown jewel of his reign was completing and dedicating the Colosseum, with 100 days of spectacular games that showcased Rome's wealth and power. These weren't just entertainment, they were employment programs for actors, gladiators, and stage crews, plus free fun for citizens who'd been through some rough years recently. His sudden death from fever in 81 CE genuinely devastated Romans, who'd finally found an emperor who combined military skill with personal generosity and actually caring about regular people's problems. People mourned him like they'd lost a beloved family member, which was pretty rare for emperors. Titus had shown that short reigns could still be transformative when emperors focused on actually helping their people rather than just accumulating power. His death would bring his younger brother Domitian to the throne, and that transition would prove that being related to a great emperor didn't automatically make you one. From the beloved older brother to the paranoid younger one, meet Emperor number 11, Domitian.
This capable administrator turned tyrant ruled from 81 to 96 CE, taking power at age 30 and spending the next 15 years gradually transforming from competent ruler into the kind of emperor who made people nostalgic for the good old days of civil war. Domitian had spent decades in his father's and brother's shadows, developing both real administrative skills and some serious resentment about being the spare heir. His early reign actually showed promise. He strengthened frontier defenses, improved provincial administration, and continued the Flavian building programs that were making Rome beautiful. His military achievements were genuinely impressive. Successful campaigns in Britain extended Roman control further north. His Danube wars secured the frontier against Germanic tribes, and he maintained efficient tax collection that kept the empire financially stable. The problem wasn't his competence, it was his personality. As the years went on, Domitian became increasingly paranoid about palace conspiracies and Senate plots. He executed senators on trumped-up treason charges, demanded to be addressed as Lord and God, and created an atmosphere of terror that reminded everyone of Caligula's worst moments. The difference was that Domitian was actually competent, which made him scarier. His reign ended in 96 CE through a carefully planned palace conspiracy involving his wife Domitia, court officials, and Praetorian commanders who'd finally had enough of his paranoid micromanagement. The assassination was so well organized that the Senate immediately proclaimed Nerva as his replacement before Domitian's body was even cold. Domitian's legacy was complicated. He'd been an efficient administrator whose competence was completely overshadowed by his tyrannical methods. His death would bring the elderly Nerva to power, and that old senator would make a decision that would create the greatest period in Roman history.
After Domitian's paranoid tyranny, here comes the elder statesman who accidentally saved the empire. Emperor number 12, Nerva. This 66-year-old senator ruled for less than 2 years, from 96 to 98 CE, but his brief reign established the principle that would create Rome's golden age. Marcus Cocceius Nerva was chosen by the conspirators who'd killed Domitian because they needed a respected placeholder who wouldn't rock the boat. At 66, this childless senator represented everything Domitian wasn't: moderate, cultured, and committed to working with the Senate, rather than treating it like his personal rubber stamp. His most brilliant move was adopting Trajan as his heir and co-emperor, establishing the principle that emperors should choose successors based on who was actually qualified, rather than just who happened to share their DNA. This decision would create the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, widely considered the peak of Roman civilization and the closest thing to good government the ancient world ever saw. During his brief time in charge, Nerva released political exiles, ended the paranoid treason trials, gave land to poor citizens, and reduced taxes while somehow maintaining military strength. He proved that imperial power could be used with restraint and wisdom instead of fear and excess, revolutionary concepts after Domitian's reign. His natural death in 98 CE was mourned, but not unexpected given his age. More importantly, his succession plan worked perfectly. Trajan took over smoothly, validating the adoptive principle that would govern Rome for the next century and create what historians call the 5 good emperors.
Nerva had done something remarkable. He'd put the empire's needs ahead of his own ego by choosing the best possible successor rather than trying to start a dynasty. His wisdom would be proven by what came next, because Trajan was about to show the world what a truly great emperor could accomplish.
Now we meet one of the absolute legends. Emperor number 13, Trajan. This Spanish general took power at age 45 in 98 CE and ruled for 19 years until his death at 64, expanding the Roman Empire to its greatest size while earning the title Best of Rulers that later emperors could only dream of matching. Born in Spain, Trajan was the first emperor from outside Italy, showing that the empire had evolved from a Roman institution into something truly international. His military background and provincial perspective brought fresh energy to imperial administration, while Nerva's adoption had given him constitutional legitimacy, the perfect combination. His military achievements read like the greatest hits of Roman conquest. He conquered Dacia, modern Romania, and brought so much gold back to Rome that it funded building projects for decades, briefly extended Roman control beyond the Euphrates River into modern Iraq, and generally made every other empire in the known world nervous about what he might do next. But Trajan wasn't just about conquering stuff. He implemented massive building programs throughout the empire, from his famous baths and forum in Rome to infrastructure projects in distant provinces. His administrative reforms strengthened the imperial bureaucracy, while his legal innovations protected citizens' rights and provincial interests better than ever before. He died in 117 CE while returning from his eastern campaigns, reportedly saying he regretted leaving unfinished business in Mesopotamia. His reign had shown that imperial expansion and good government could work together, creating prosperity and stability across the Mediterranean world that people still talk about today. Later emperors would be judged against Trajan's standard. The Senate's traditional blessing became, "May you be more fortunate than Augustus and better than Trajan," which basically acknowledged that this Spanish general had set the bar impossibly high for everyone who came after.
From Trajan the Conqueror to his traveling successor, meet Emperor number 14, Hadrian. This Renaissance man became emperor at age 41 in 117 CE and spent the next 21 years until his death at 62 personally visiting every corner of his vast domain while transforming imperial policy from expansion to making what they already had actually work. Hadrian was Trajan's cousin and adopted heir, but he couldn't have been more different from his predecessor. While Trajan conquered new territories, Hadrian was more interested in understanding the ones Rome already controlled. He spoke fluent Greek and Latin, appreciated Egyptian and Celtic cultures, and basically turned being emperor into the world's most expensive study abroad program. His most famous achievement was Hadrian's Wall across northern Britain, an 84-mile stone barrier that basically told the Scottish tribes, "This is as far as we're going, thanks." But this was just one of countless building projects, the Pantheon in Rome, which is still standing and still amazing, new cities in Egypt, and renovated temples throughout Greece and Asia Minor. The darkest moment of his reign was the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea from 132 to 136 CE, which he crushed so thoroughly that Jerusalem was refounded as a Roman city and Jews were banned from entering it. This brutal response contradicted his otherwise enlightened governance and showed that even philosopher emperors could be ruthless when they felt threatened.
His death in 138 CE ended a reign that had stabilized imperial borders while celebrating learning and culture like never before. Hadrian had proven that emperors could be both effective administrators and genuine intellectuals, though few of his successors would have either the brains or the energy to match his example. The man who'd traveled constantly to understand his empire had created a golden age of peace and cultural achievement. His death would pass power to Antoninus Pius, who would take a completely different approach to imperial administration.
From Hadrian, the constant traveler, to his stay-at-home successor, here's Emperor number 15, Antoninus Pius. This wealthy senator from France became emperor at age 51 in 138 CE and ruled for 23 years until his death at 74, earning his nickname Pius through dutiful governance and proving that sometimes the best thing an emperor can do is stay home and handle the paperwork. Hadrian chose Antoninus specifically because he was the opposite of exciting. Cultured, competent, and committed to Roman values without any of the personal quirks that had made previous emperors interesting but exhausting. After decades of Hadrian's constant traveling and building projects, Romans were ready for someone who would just sit in Rome and govern quietly. His remarkable achievement was maintaining peace and prosperity for 23 years without ever leaving Italy, something no emperor had managed since Augustus. While Hadrian had traveled constantly, Antoninus proved you could run a global empire effectively through good correspondence and trusted subordinates, which was probably a relief for everyone involved. The empire experienced unprecedented stability during his reign. Economic growth, cultural development, and minimal military conflict. His only major war was in Britain, where Roman forces built the Antonine Wall even further north than Hadrian's barrier, though this was later abandoned because apparently even the Romans had limits on how much Scottish weather they could handle. His peaceful death in 161 CE marked the end of an era. He was the last emperor who would die naturally without facing major revolts or invasions. His reign had demonstrated that competent administration and constitutional governance could maintain imperial greatness without dramatic gestures or personal charisma. Antoninus Pius had proven that boring could be beautiful in imperial politics. Sometimes the best emperors are those who govern so well that historians don't have much dramatic material to write about. His death would bring Marcus Aurelius to power, the philosopher-emperor who would face challenges his peaceful predecessor had never imagined.
From practical Antoninus to the philosopher-emperor himself, meet number 16, Marcus Aurelius. This thoughtful ruler took power at age 40 in 161 CE and spent the next 19 years until his death at 58 trying to apply Stoic philosophy to the brutal realities of running an empire during increasingly tough times. Marcus Aurelius had been groomed for power through decades of careful preparation under Antoninus Pius, receiving the best philosophical education money could buy. Unlike previous emperors who stumbled into philosophy, Marcus genuinely believed in duty, virtue, and the common good, which sounds great until you realize he'd have to apply these ideals while dealing with plagues, barbarian invasions, and family members who definitely hadn't read the same philosophy books. His reign faced challenges that would have tested any ruler. A devastating plague swept through the empire from 165 to 180 CE, killing millions, while Germanic tribes pressed against the northern frontiers with new intensity. His personal notebook, the Meditations, reveals a leader struggling to stay philosophical while dealing with the kind of real-world problems that would make anyone question their beliefs. The defining achievement of his reign was successfully defending Rome's northern frontiers through the long Marcomannic Wars, though these conflicts consumed enormous resources and marked the beginning of serious barbarian pressure that would define the next century. He spent his final years personally campaigning along the Danube, trying to hold back tribes that were becoming increasingly organized and dangerous. His death in 180 CE at a military camp near Vienna ended the era of the 5 good emperors and began what historians politely call a more challenging period. His philosophical writings would inspire people for centuries, proving that intellectual depth and political responsibility could coexist even during crisis periods. Marcus Aurelius had faced the empire's growing challenges with philosophical courage, even if he couldn't solve them entirely. His death would pass power to his son Commodus, and that handoff would prove that even the best parents can produce terrible children.
From philosopher-emperor to megalomaniac gladiator, here's Emperor number 17, Commodus. This walking disaster inherited the throne at age 19 in 180 CE and spent the next 12 years until his assassination at 31, proving that hereditary succession was the Roman Empire's fatal flaw. Commodus was the first emperor born to the purple in decades, which meant he'd never had to earn anything or prove himself worthy of power. His father, Marcus Aurelius, had tried to give him a proper education, but apparently all those philosophy lessons bounced right off because Commodus was more interested in gladiator fights than governing an empire. His most notorious achievements included renaming Rome Colonia Commodiana after himself, Settle, fighting as a gladiator in public spectacles where he always won because nobody was stupid enough to actually try to beat the emperor, and declaring himself the reincarnation of the hero Hercules. He basically turned imperial administration into his personal fantasy football league. While Commodus was playing dress-up and fighting rigged gladiator matches, the empire started falling apart. Provincial governors gained dangerous independence because nobody was watching them. Military discipline declined because the emperor was too busy posing for statues, and the Praetorian Guard effectively ran imperial policy, while Commodus focused on his athletic career. His reign ended on New Year's Eve 192 CE, when his wrestling partner Narcissus strangled him in his bath, part of a conspiracy involving his mistress, Martia, and the Praetorian prefect, who'd finally realized that having a completely insane emperor wasn't working out for anyone. Even his closest associates had gotten tired of the constant drama. Commodus had single-handedly ended the golden age of the Antonines, proving that individual character mattered more than institutional stability. His death would trigger another civil war period because nobody had bothered to plan for succession. They'd been too busy trying to keep the emperor from getting them all killed.
After Commodus's insanity, meet the brief voice of reason, Emperor number 18, Pertinax. This son of a freed slave became emperor at age 66 in January 193 CE and tried to restore imperial dignity for exactly 87 days,
before the very forces he was trying to reform decided they preferred corruption to competence. Publius Helvius Pertinax had risen through pure merit from humble origins to become a respected senator and provincial governor, representing everything Romans claimed to value about advancement through virtue rather than birth. The conspirators who killed Commodus chose him specifically because he had a reputation for integrity and competence, qualities that had been in short supply recently. His ambitious reform program tried to undo 12 years of Commodine chaos. He restricted gladiatorial games, recalled political exiles, sold off imperial luxuries to fund the treasury, and most dangerously, tried to restore discipline to the Praetorian Guard. These were exactly the changes Rome needed, but they were also exactly the changes that would make him enemies among people who'd been profiting from the previous dysfunction. The fatal moment came when he refused to pay the Praetorians their traditional accession bonus, declaring the treasury too empty for such expensive gifts. This was fiscally responsible and morally correct, but it was also a death sentence. Soldiers who expected rewards weren't interested in lectures about government budgets from some old guy who thought duty was more important than money. His assassination in March 193 CE by the very gods he was trying to reform launched the year of 5 emperors, as the empire was literally auctioned off to the highest bidder. Pertinax had proven that good character and reform programs were meaningless without the political skills to implement them safely. His death showed the fundamental problem facing anyone who wanted to fix Rome's government. Those with the integrity to govern well often lacked the ruthlessness needed to survive in a system that had become thoroughly corrupted. The empire was about to learn what happened when power went to whoever could pay the most for it.
From principled reform to shameless capitalism, meet Emperor number 19, Didius Julianus. This wealthy senator literally bought the Roman Empire at auction in March 193 CE and ruled for 66 days before his purchase was forcibly returned at age 60, proving that some things shouldn't be for sale, even in ancient Rome. Marcus Didius Severus Julianus was having dinner when news arrived that the Praetorian Guards were holding an actual auction for imperial power after murdering Pertinax. Instead of being horrified by this unprecedented corruption, he saw a business opportunity and raced to the Praetorian camp to place his bid against Pertinax's father-in-law. His winning bid was 25,000 sestertii per guard, a fortune that immediately bankrupted the imperial treasury, but secured him the purple robe and the dubious honor of being history's only emperor who came with a receipt. The guards were happy to make the sale, proving that even Rome's elite military units had their price when it came to treason. His achievements as emperor were mostly financial disasters, as he desperately tried to raise money to pay his promised bribes while provincial armies declared their own emperors in disgust. Turns out, buying power was much easier than keeping it, especially when your entire legitimacy rested on what was essentially a very expensive bribe. The empire immediately rejected his authority. Septimius Severus marched from the Danube, Pescennius Niger was proclaimed in Syria, and even Roman citizens mocked their purchased emperor by chanting insults whenever he appeared in public. His reign became a joke that nobody found funny except possibly the Praetorians counting their money. His death in June 193 CE came when the Senate condemned him as Severus's armies approached Rome, and the same guards who'd sold him the throne abandoned him faster than you could say buyer's remorse. His execution ended the empire's brief experiment with direct democracy through bribery.
Didius Julianus had proven that imperial legitimacy couldn't be purchased like a fancy villa. It required some combination of military support, popular acceptance, or constitutional process that money alone couldn't provide. His death would bring a real soldier to power, someone who understood that empires were won through strength, not auction bids.
Meet Emperor number 20, Septimius Severus, the tough guy from Africa who proved that sometimes Rome needed a real soldier to fix its problems. This career fighter from North Africa ruled from 193 to 211 CE, grabbing power at age 48 and holding on to it for 18 years until he died at 65. He rose from the complete mess of the year of 5 emperors to start the last great royal family through being better at war than everyone else. When news reached his army base that some rich senator had literally bought the throne from the bodyguards like it was on sale at the market, Severus didn't just roll his eyes, he declared war. While Didius Julianus was desperately scraping together coins to pay his bribes, Severus was already marching toward Rome with soldiers who actually knew how to fight. His lightning-fast campaign proved that the guys defending the borders had become more Roman than the Romans living in fancy houses. This guy's war record reads like the ultimate action movie. He crushed 3 rival emperors in civil wars, invaded Scotland because apparently Hadrian's Wall wasn't scary enough, and launched attacks in the Middle East that brought enemy capitals under Roman control. But Severus wasn't just about winning battles. He doubled soldier pay, expanded the army, and started recruiting tough frontier guys instead of pampered Italians who probably complained about the food. His deathbed advice to his sons perfectly shows what kind of guy he was. Keep the soldiers happy and ignore everyone else. This wasn't just military thinking. It was his realistic take that the empire would survive by keeping armies loyal, rather than worrying about senators or regular citizens. His changes turned Rome into an open military state, ending any pretense that emperors ruled through fancy constitutional stuff. Severus died in 211 CE at York while fighting in Britain, probably the last emperor who actually made the empire stronger during his time in charge. His legacy was a militarized state that cared more about soldiers than civilians, a system that would control Roman politics for the next 100 years. But here's the thing about military families. Great generals often have terrible kids, and Severus's son was about to prove that getting an empire handed to you and actually knowing how to run it are totally different things. From military genius dad to psycho son, here's Emperor number 21, Caracalla, who became emperor at just 23 years old in 211 CE and ruled until someone finally put him out of everyone's misery at age 29 in 217 CE. Born with the name Lucius Septimius Basonianus, he got his nickname from a hooded cloak he loved wearing, though after what he did to his family, his fashion sense was the least weird thing about him. He was supposed to share power with his younger brother Geta, but Caracalla had a creative solution to sibling rivalry. He murdered his brother during a fake peace meeting right in front of their mom. Then he had the nerve to claim self-defense. This wasn't just regular family drama. It was a PR nightmare that required killing thousands of Geta's supporters to keep up the lie that Caracalla was somehow the victim here. His one genuinely good idea was something called the Constitutio Antoniana in 212 CE, which made every free person in the empire a Roman citizen, basically turning Roman from meaning guy from Rome to guy who follows Roman laws. This was partly because Caracalla thought Alexander the Great was cool and wanted to copy him, and partly because more citizens meant more people to tax for his expensive military habit.
The emperor's obsession with copying Alexander led him to fight constantly, throwing money at soldiers while making coins worth less to pay for it all. His eastern campaign showed he could actually plan wars pretty well, but his methods were so brutal that he created enemies faster than a YouTube comment section. Even his own bodyguard boss started planning to kill him when Caracalla's paranoia reached murderous levels. His death in 217 CE happened while he was literally taking a bathroom break during his war campaign, killed by his own bodyguard on orders from the head of his security, who'd found out his name was on Caracalla's hit list. Talk about poor timing and even worse, bathroom security. Caracalla had completely changed what it meant to be Roman, but his reign proved that even great ideas couldn't save an emperor who mixed military smarts with complete mental instability. His death would kick off another "who's gonna be emperor next" crisis, because apparently the Severan family's military improvements couldn't solve the basic problem of producing kids who weren't crazy.
From imperial dynasty to bureaucratic takeover, meet Emperor number 22, Macrinus. This office worker turned emperor ruled from 217 to 218 CE, becoming the first guy from the middle management class to grab the top job and proving that knowing how to run meetings doesn't automatically make you good at running empires. Marcus Opellius Macrinus was basically Caracalla's chief of staff, the praetorian prefect who'd organized his boss's bathroom assassination to save his own neck after discovering he was on the emperor's kill list. At age 53, he suddenly found himself, reluctantly, acclaimed emperor by troops who needed someone, anyone, to lead them home from the disaster zone that was Caracalla's eastern campaign. His brief reign focused on trying to clean up the financial mess Caracalla had left behind, which meant ending the expensive Eastern War and, most dangerously, cutting military pay and privileges. These were smart economic policies that, unfortunately, required making the people with swords unhappy, which is generally not a survival strategy for Roman emperors. The crisis came when the Syrian imperial women, Julia Domna's sister and her family, started promoting teenager Heliogabalus as Caracalla's secret son. This claim was probably completely false, but soldiers apparently preferred familiar lies to unfamiliar competence, especially when the familiar lies came with promises of better pay. His death came at the Battle of Antioch in 218 CE, where his forces were defeated by Heliogabalus's supporters. Macrinus was captured while trying to escape back to Rome and executed, ending the first attempt by the imperial bureaucracy to cut out the middleman and rule directly. Macrinus had learned that technical qualifications for running government meant nothing without either dynastic legitimacy or charismatic leadership, lessons that future middle managers would remember when planning their own hostile takeovers. His death brought to power a teenager who would make Caracalla look normal by comparison.
From competent administrator to teenage religious revolutionary, meet Emperor number 23, Heliogabalus. This 14-year-old Syrian became emperor in 218 CE through his grandmother's scheming, and spent the next 4 years, until his assassination at 18, making Caligula look like a model of restraint and good judgment. Born Varius Avitus Bassianus, this kid was proclaimed emperor through his grandmother's Julia Mace's political manipulations, claiming to be Caracalla's secret son, despite looking nothing like him. His real qualification was serving as high priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, whose worship he intended to make Rome's official religion, because apparently what the empire really needed was a teenage religious fanatic in charge. His achievements included trying to replace Jupiter with his Syrian god, marrying a Vestal virgin, thereby breaking her sacred vows and probably dooming Rome to divine punishment, and reportedly asking doctors about gender transition surgery, behavior that horrified traditional Romans who thought their emperors should at least pretend to follow Roman customs. The scandals just kept coming. He married and divorced multiple people, including men, which Romans considered legally impossible, allegedly worked as a prostitute in taverns for fun, and openly solicited customers in the imperial palace. His religious reforms actually reflected growing Eastern influence in Roman culture, but his methods were deliberately designed to shock and offend traditional sensibilities. His reign ended in 222 CE when the Praetorian Guard, encouraged by his own grandmother Julia Maesa and his cousin Alexander Severus, decided they had enough teenage rebellion for one lifetime. Both Elagabalus and his mother Julia Soaemeus were murdered, and their bodies were dragged through Rome and thrown into the Tiber River, the ultimate Roman insult. Elagabalus had pushed imperial behavior beyond any acceptable limits, proving that even absolute power had cultural boundaries that couldn't be crossed without fatal consequences. His death would bring his more conventional cousin to power, but the damage to imperial prestige would take years to repair.
From teenage scandal to attempted restoration, meet Emperor number 24, Alexander Severus. This 13-year-old became emperor in 222 CE through the same family connections that had elevated his crazy cousin, but spent the next 13 years until his death at 26 trying desperately to restore traditional Roman values while facing military challenges that would ultimately doom his efforts. Born Alexanius, this kid was Elagabalus's cousin and part of the same Syrian imperial family, but he represented the normal branch that people could actually live with. At 13, he obviously needed adult supervision, which came first from his formidable grandmother, Julia Maesa, and then his equally tough mother, Julia Mamaea, proving that behind every successful boy emperor was a woman who actually knew what she was doing. His genuine achievements included legal reforms that protected slaves and regular citizens, financial policies that restored economic stability after years of chaos, and building programs that gave people jobs while making cities look better. Alexander's reign showed that competent civilian government was still possible, even when run by a teenager and his mom. The problem was that all this good governance happened during a period when Germanic tribes and the new Sassanid Empire were launching major attacks against Roman frontiers. His diplomatic solutions and negotiated peace treaties were smart policy, but looked weak to soldiers who expected their emperors to solve problems by killing the people causing them. His death in 335 CE came when mutinous troops in Germany murdered both Alexander and his mother Julia Mamaea, proclaiming the giant soldier Maximinus Thrax as emperor instead. The army had decided that nice guys with good intentions weren't what the empire needed when barbarians were literally at the gates.
Alexander Severus had proven that good government without military credibility was useless during crisis periods, while his death marked the end of the last successful dynasty and the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century. 50 years when the empire nearly collapsed under external pressure and internal chaos. The lesson was clear. Being a decent person wasn't enough when the world was falling apart.
From civilian government to military brutality, meet Emperor number 25, Maximinus Thrax. This 8-foot-tall giant from the countryside became emperor at age 62 in 235 CE through pure soldier power, and launched the crisis of the 3rd century by proving that military force without political sense was a recipe for disaster. Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus was everything traditional Romans feared about the barbarization of their military. A peasant from Thrace who'd risen through army ranks by being bigger and stronger than everyone else. When Alexander Severus's diplomacy failed to impress frontier troops, they decided what they really needed was someone who solved problems by hitting them with very large objects. His defining characteristic was treating the entire empire like a military campaign. Maximinus spent his whole reign fighting beyond the Rhine and Danube, while squeezing provinces for money to fund his constant warfare. He never even visited Rome, running the empire through strongly worded letters, while personally leading armies against Germanic and Sarmatian tribes, who probably wondered what they'd done to deserve this giant angry man. His policies created inevitable opposition everywhere. The Senate declared him a public enemy, African provinces rebelled under the Gordian family, and Italian cities started building walls to keep his tax collectors out. When your own empire is fortifying itself against you, that's usually a sign that your leadership style needs work. His death came during the siege of Aquileia in 238 CE, when his own exhausted troops, attracted by senatorial promises of better treatment, murdered both Maximinus and his son Maximus. Even his loyal soldiers had finally gotten tired of constant war and decided that maybe someone else's leadership style might involve less marching and more food. Maximinus Thrax had established the template for barracks emperors, military strongmen who ruled through force alone. But his death proved that even the most powerful generals couldn't survive when they made enemies of literally everyone. His reign kicked off the crisis period that would nearly destroy the empire over the next 50 years. Brief interlude of aristocratic resistance. Meet Emperor number 26, Gordian the Older. This 79-year-old proconsul was proclaimed emperor by African rebels in 238 CE and ruled for exactly 21 days before his death, representing the traditional Roman elite's last desperate attempt to restore civilized government against military dictatorship. Marcus Antonius Gordianus Sempronianus Romanus was probably the oldest person ever to become emperor, proclaimed by African tax resistors who'd had enough of Maximinus Thrax's brutal collection methods. At 79, he brought decades of administrative experience and scholarly reputation to a job that really needed someone who could organize effective resistance against professional armies, which was not exactly his specialty. His brief reign was spent frantically trying to build an anti-Maximinus coalition while sharing power with his son, Gordian II. Because apparently, even desperate rebels understood that 79-year-olds needed backup plans.
Together, they represented traditional Roman aristocracy's attempt to prove that education and constitutional legitimacy could triumph over brute military force. The reality check came when Numidia's governor, Capellianus, who'd stayed loyal to Maximinus, invaded Africa with the experienced Legion III Augusta. The Battle of Carthage was basically a masterclass in why untrained provincial militias shouldn't fight professional soldiers, no matter how righteous their cause might be. His suicide in 238 CE, after learning that his son had died leading their amateur forces against veteran troops, ended the aristocratic rebellion after less than a month. The brief Gordian experiment had demonstrated that good intentions and constitutional authority meant nothing when facing people with actual military experience. His death proved that the old republic's civilian traditions were completely dead. Imperial survival now required either professional armies, popular uprising, or sheer luck rather than senatorial approval and scholarly credentials. The crisis would continue, but it wouldn't be solved by elderly intellectuals.
Following his elderly father into doomed rebellion, meet Emperor number 27, Gordian II. This middle-aged son co-ruled with his father for 21 days in 238 CE before dying heroically in battle while trying to defend African independence against imperial tyranny, proving that courage couldn't overcome bad military planning. Marcus Antonius Gordianus Semproianus Romanus Jr. had administrative experience as his father's assistant in Africa, but no military training for the crisis they were facing. His co-emperor status represented traditional Roman dynastic thinking. Even during desperate rebellions, Romans couldn't imagine rule without succession planning, which showed how deeply imperial monarchy had replaced republican government. His defining moment was personally leading African provincial forces against Capellianus's professional legion at Carthage, demonstrating the kind of physical bravery that his scholarly family background hadn't suggested. This decision to fight rather than negotiate showed traditional Roman values of duty and honor, even when facing hopeless odds against superior forces. The battle was predictably one-sided. Provincial militias armed with good intentions couldn't match professional soldiers with actual training and equipment. Gordian II died fighting, probably knowing that surrender would just mean a slower execution, so he chose to die like a Roman magistrate defending his people. His death ended the Gordian dynasty's first attempt at power, though his nephew would later become emperor under very different circumstances. The younger Gordian had proven that aristocratic virtue still existed in the Roman world, even if it couldn't compete with military reality during crisis periods. His brief reign illustrated the tragedy of the 3rd century crisis. Decent people kept trying to restore constitutional government, while the empire descended into military chaos that would last for decades. Good men were dying for principles that the practical world had already abandoned. From failed rebellion to power-sharing experiment, meet Emperor number 28, Pupienus. This elderly senator co-ruled with his colleague Balbinus for 99 days in 238 CE, representing the Senate's desperate attempt to govern through committee during the ongoing crisis, which worked about as well as you'd expect. Marcus Clodius Pupienus Maximus had military experience from provincial commands, making him the Senate's choice for handling Maximinus Thrax's advancing armies, while his colleague managed civilian affairs.
At age 74, his appointment showed that Roman leadership had become a job for old guys who remembered when things worked better, though whether experience could fix current problems remained to be seen. His remarkable achievement was actually defeating Maximinus Thrax through a combination of siege tactics, propaganda, and enemy troop mutiny at Aquileia. When Maximinus's soldiers finally murdered their emperor, Pupienus had successfully defended Italy against barbarian invasion, a genuine military victory during the crisis period that nobody thought was possible. But military success against external enemies couldn't solve internal political problems. Pupienus and Balbinus spent their brief joint reign quarreling over authority and policy, while the Praetorian Guard grew increasingly hostile to being governed by senators who thought they were too good for military input on imperial decision-making. Their deaths in July 238 CE came when Praetorians dragged both emperors from the palace and murdered them in the streets, immediately proclaiming 13-year-old Gordian III as their preferred successor. The guards had concluded that child emperors were easier to manage than elderly senators who had opinions about things without consulting the military. Pupienus had proven that even successful military leadership couldn't overcome the fundamental crisis of imperial legitimacy during the 3rd century. His victory against Maximinus Thrax was meaningless because the system itself was broken, and Romans were about to try child emperors again.
Joint ruler in an impossible situation. Meet Emperor number 29, Balbinus. This aristocratic senator co-ruled with Pupienus for 99 days in 238 CE, attempting to manage civilian government while his colleague handled military affairs in what became Rome's most dysfunctional power-sharing arrangement. Decimus Caelius Calvinus Balbinus represented the traditional Roman elite's administrative expertise, chosen by senators specifically for his reputation for competence in civilian governance. His joint appointment with the more militarily experienced Pupienus showed that even desperate senators understood the empire needed both civilian and military skills. They just couldn't figure out how to combine them effectively. His job was managing Rome itself, while Pupienus dealt with Maximinus Thrax's invasion, maintaining public order, organizing supply systems, and handling the increasingly hostile Praetorian Guards who resented being governed by people who treated them like glorified security guards rather than the empire's kingmakers. The fundamental problem was that joint rule simply didn't work when both emperors competed for prestige and disagreed on policy. Balbinus and Pupienus undermined each other through public arguments in competing initiatives, proving that Roman government required unified command, especially during crisis periods when quick decisions meant survival. His death alongside Pupienus in July 238 CE ended the Senate's last serious attempt to govern directly rather than through military strongmen. The Praetorians who murdered both emperors had decided that even incompetent child emperors were preferable to competent adults who couldn't agree on anything. Balbinus had demonstrated that traditional administrative skills were useless without unified leadership and military credibility. His death marked the end of senatorial independence. Future emperors would rise through army support, not constitutional appointment, for the remainder of the imperial period.
From joint rule chaos to child emperor, meet Emperor number 30, Gordian III. This 13-year-old became emperor in 238 CE through Praetorian Guard politics and managed to rule for 6 years until his death at 19, showing that sometimes having competent adults run things while you learn the job actually works. Marcus Antonius Gordianus was the grandson of the failed African rebels Gordian I and II, proclaimed emperor by guards who just murdered the previous 2 rulers and needed someone with dynastic legitimacy who wouldn't cause them problems. At 13, he represented the ultimate compromise candidate, legitimate enough to justify their coup, but young enough to be completely controllable. His reign's success came through effective regency government, first under court officials and later under Praetorian prefect Timesitheus, whose military competence and administrative skill kept the empire running while Gordian learned imperial basics. This arrangement proved that competent ministers could govern effectively even under teenage figureheads. The defining achievement was the successful Eastern campaign against Persia, where Roman forces under Timesitheus' command recaptured lost territories and restored imperial prestige. These victories showed that proper leadership could still achieve military success despite the ongoing internal political chaos that had characterized recent decades. The turning point came when Timesitheus died and was replaced by Philip the Arab as Praetorian prefect, fundamentally changing court power dynamics. Philip quickly gained control over the young emperor while positioning himself for eventual succession through careful manipulation of military loyalties and imperial decision-making. His death in 244 CE during the Mesopotamian campaign was officially called an accident, but Philip's immediate proclamation as emperor by the same troops suggested something more suspicious. At 19, Gordian III had ruled longer than most crisis-period emperors, despite starting as a child, though real power had always belonged to whoever controlled the armies rather than whoever wore the purple.
From power behind the throne to emperor himself, meet number 31, Philip the Arab. This provincial general ruled from 244 to 249 CE, rising from nowhere through court intrigue and military connections, while trying to restore imperial stability through spectacular celebrations and competent administration. Marcus Julius Philippus came from modern Jordan, making him another example of how the empire's leadership had become truly international rather than just Roman or Italian. He'd worked his way up to become Praetorian prefect under the teenage Gordian III, essentially running the empire while the kid learned on the job, until he decided to cut out the middleman and take direct control. His most memorable achievement was celebrating Rome's millennium in 248 CE with spectacular games and building projects that reminded citizens of imperial grandeur despite ongoing military pressures. These celebrations were partly genuine pride in Roman achievement and partly propaganda designed to convince people that the empire was still strong and unified despite decades of crisis. Philip also successfully managed multiple external threats: Germanic invasions across the Danube, Gothic raids in the Balkans, and renewed Persian attacks in the east. His reign represented competent crisis management by someone who understood that imperial survival required both military success and public confidence in government effectiveness. His downfall came when Decius, sent to suppress military mutinies on the Danube frontier, was proclaimed emperor by troops who decided they preferred their general to the distant emperor in Rome. The Battle of Verona in 249 CE ended Philip's attempt at stable governance, proving that even competent emperors couldn't survive when their own generals turned against them. Philip had shown that provincial talent could still provide effective imperial leadership, though his death demonstrated that systemic problems couldn't be solved by individual competence alone. His defeat would bring Decius to power, and that new emperor had some very specific ideas about what was wrong with Roman society.
From reluctant military commander to persecutor emperor, meet number 32, Decius. This conservative senator ruled from 249 to 251 CE, launching the first empire-wide Christian persecution, while facing barbarian invasions that would kill him and fundamentally change Rome's relationship with its enemies. Gaius Messius Quintus Decius was sent by Philip the Arab to deal with military mutinies on the Danube, only to find himself proclaimed emperor by troops who preferred his military experience to Philip's court politics. His elevation was allegedly reluctant. He supposedly didn't want the job, but he certainly accepted it once his soldiers made the decision for him. His most controversial policy was a systematic persecution of Christians throughout the empire, requiring all citizens to sacrifice to traditional Roman gods and get certificates proving their compliance. This wasn't just religious intolerance. Decius genuinely believed that Christian refusal to honor the gods was causing divine punishment in the form of military disasters and natural catastrophes. The military challenges were overwhelming. Massive Gothic confederations crossed the Danube in organized invasions, besieging cities and devastating entire provinces, while Roman armies struggled to respond effectively. These weren't just raids for loot. These were large-scale population movements by tribes being pushed west by other migrations further east. His death at the Battle of Abritus in 251 CE made him the first emperor killed in battle against foreign enemies, falling alongside his son Herennius Etruscus while fighting Gothic forces in swampland that favored the enemy. This defeat represented a new low point in Roman military prestige and a turning point in barbarian Roman relations. Decius had tried to restore traditional Roman values through religious persecution and military aggression, but his death proved that individual imperial will couldn't overcome the empire's fundamental strategic vulnerabilities. The Goths had learned they could actually kill Roman emperors, which was information they definitely wouldn't forget.
Brief co-ruler in family tragedy, meet Emperor number 33, Herennius Etruscus. This young man co-ruled with his father Decius from 251 CE until their joint death later that year, becoming part of the first imperial father-son team to die together fighting foreign enemies. Quintus Herennius Etruscus Messius Decius was proclaimed Caesar and co-emperor by his father, representing another attempt at dynastic succession during the crisis period. His role was mainly ceremonial, while he learned imperial administration, though his brief time in power was entirely consumed by the Gothic crisis that threatened the empire's northern frontiers. His tragic distinction was dying alongside his father at the Battle of Abritus against Gothic invaders, making them the first emperor and heir to fall together in the same battle. Both men had been leading from the front against barbarian forces, showing personal courage that unfortunately couldn't overcome tactical disadvantages or enemy numerical superiority. The double loss represented a devastating blow to Roman morale and military prestige. It was one thing for emperors to be murdered by their own people, but quite another for foreign enemies to kill imperial families in open battle. This defeat marked a psychological turning point where barbarian tribes realized they could actually win against Roman armies, rather than just conducting successful raids. His brief reign illustrated the risks of dynastic succession during military crises. Both father and son died trying to personally restore Roman military reputation, leaving the empire leaderless at exactly the moment when it needed strong leadership most. Their joint deaths would create another succession crisis during ongoing external invasions. The Battle of Abritus would be remembered as the moment barbarian warfare became an existential threat rather than a manageable border problem, and the deaths of Decius and Herennius Etruscus had shown the world that even Roman emperors weren't safe from the chaos that was reshaping the ancient world.
From joint death to plague victim, meet Emperor number 34, Hostilian. This younger son of Decius briefly ruled in 251 CE after surviving the battle that killed his father and brother, only to die from the same plague that was devastating the empire, along with barbarian invasions. Gaius Valens Hostilianus Messius Quintus had stayed in Rome while his father and brother campaigned against the Goths, which turned out to be the smart move when the Battle of Abritus killed both of them. At just 20 years old, he suddenly found himself as the surviving heir to an empire that was falling apart from multiple directions at once. Not exactly the inheritance any young man dreams of. Initially, he shared power with Trebonianus Gallus, who'd assumed control after the military disaster on the Danube. This power-sharing arrangement represented another attempt at combining dynastic legitimacy with military necessity, though both emperors were basically trying to manage a crisis that was bigger than anything the Roman government had faced before. His brief reign was completely dominated by the plague epidemic that had been killing massive numbers of people since the 240s, weakening Roman resistance to barbarian invasions while destroying the tax base needed to fund any kind of military response. Cities were dying, armies were dying, and the imperial treasury was emptying faster than a broken bucket. The plague showed no respect for purple robes or imperial bloodlines. It killed emperors just as efficiently as it killed peasants. His death from disease in 251 CE ended the Decian dynasty after less than 3 years, demonstrating how natural disasters could accomplish what political enemies and foreign armies had failed to achieve. Hostilian's death proved that during periods when everything that could go wrong was going wrong at once, even surviving battles didn't guarantee survival. His death left Trebonianus Gallus as sole emperor, and that guy was about to learn that inheriting a plague-ridden, barbarian-invaded empire wasn't much better than sharing one.
From battle survivor to tribute pair, meet Emperor number 35, Trebonianus Gallus. This general ruled from 251 to 253 CE, attempting to manage multiple crises through diplomacy and bribery that satisfied nobody, while demonstrating just how desperate Roman imperial policy had become. Gaius Hibius Trebonianus Gallus had survived the Battle of Abrutus under circumstances that made people whisper. Some folks suspected he'd made a deal with the Goths, or even betrayed Decius and his son to save his own skin. Whether these rumors were true or not, they undermined his legitimacy while he tried to juggle ongoing barbarian invasions, internal rebellions, and plague outbreaks that were killing people faster than he could recruit replacements. His most controversial policy was paying tribute to Gothic tribes to prevent further invasions, basically bribing barbarians to leave Roman territory alone instead of defeating them militarily. This was probably the most realistic solution available, given the empire's weakened condition. But it was politically toxic, because Romans expected their emperors to defeat enemies, not write them checks like some kind of ancient protection racket. The guy faced the same impossible combination of problems that had killed his predecessors. Continued Gothic pressure along the Danube, Persian attacks in the east that drained military resources, renewed plague outbreaks that devastated urban populations, and internal revolts by provincial commanders who thought they could do better. His government could barely respond to one crisis before another one popped up somewhere else. His death in 253 CE came when Aemilianus, sent to defend the Danube frontier, was proclaimed emperor by troops who blamed Gallus for ongoing military humiliations and his embarrassing tribute payments. The brief civil war ended with Gallus's defeat and murder near Rome, along with his son and co-emperor Volusianus. Another imperial family wiped out in the space of an afternoon. Trebonianus Gallus had proven that diplomatic solutions and checkbook foreign policy couldn't overcome fundamental weakness when your own soldiers lose respect for paying enemies instead of fighting them. His death brought another short-lived emperor to power, because apparently nobody had figured out sustainable solutions to the crisis that was slowly killing the empire one disaster at a time.
Joint ruler in continued crisis, meet Emperor number 36, Volusianus. This son of Trebonianus Gallus co-ruled with his father from 251 to 253 CE, sharing in both his controversial policies and his ultimate fate during the ongoing 3rd century disasters. Gaius Vibius Volusianus was proclaimed co-emperor alongside his father, representing another attempt at dynastic succession during impossible circumstances. His youth and inexperience made him completely dependent on his father's guidance throughout their joint reign, though given how that was going, maybe inexperience wasn't the biggest problem they faced. His brief reign was consumed by the same multiple crises that had plagued his father. Gothic invasions that couldn't be stopped militarily, Persian attacks that drained eastern resources, plague outbreaks that killed taxpayers faster than armies, and internal rebellions by commanders who promised better solutions than paying tribute to barbarians. The dynasty's controversial policy of bribing Gothic tribes instead of fighting them defined their entire administration, though this was probably the most realistic response to Roman military weakness. Unfortunately, realistic policies weren't necessarily popular policies, especially when soldiers wanted to fight enemies rather than pay them to go away. His death alongside his father in 253 CE, when Aemilianus's forces defeated them near Rome, marked another dynastic collapse during the crisis period.
Both emperors died attempting to maintain power against military rivals who promised more aggressive policies against external enemies, though whether those rivals could actually deliver remained to be seen. The joint deaths of Trebonianus Gallus and Volusianus illustrated how quickly imperial fortunes could change during the 3rd century, from acclamation to death in less than 2 years, with little opportunity to establish effective policies beyond just trying to survive from one crisis to the next.
From frontier commander to ultra-brief usurper, meet Emperor number 37, Aemilianus. This provincial governor ruled for about 88 days in 253 CE, representing military frustration with civilian attempts to manage barbarian invasions through checkbook diplomacy rather than sword-point negotiation. Marcus Aemilius Aemilianus had been sent by Trebonianus Gallus to defend the Danube frontier against renewed Gothic invasions, where he achieved actual military success against barbarians, rather than just paying them to temporarily leave. His soldiers proclaimed him emperor specifically because he fought enemies instead of negotiating tribute payments like some kind of ancient protection racket. His brief reign was entirely consumed by civil war, first against Trebonianus Gallus and then against Valerian, who was marching toward Rome with yet another army when Aemilianus defeated his first rival. These rapid succession changes showed how quickly military loyalties shifted when multiple generals were competing for imperial power simultaneously. His main campaign promise was aggressive military action against all enemies, rather than the defensive diplomacy that had characterized recent reigns, appealing to soldiers' professional pride and Roman citizens' desire for restored imperial prestige through victory rather than accommodation with barbarians. His death in 253 CE came when his own troops abandoned him for Valerian, whose superior forces and senatorial legitimacy offered better prospects for survival and career advancement. Aemilianus was murdered by his own men rather than facing defeat in battle, proving that Roman soldiers were practical about switching sides when necessary. His ultra-brief reign demonstrated that military success against external enemies meant nothing without broader political support or sustainable resources. Soldiers would follow winners, but only if those winners could actually keep winning against increasingly difficult odds.
From senatorial respectability to unprecedented humiliation, meet Emperor number 38, Valerian. This elderly senator ruled from 253 to 260 CE, attempting to restore imperial dignity through traditional methods before suffering the ultimate disgrace of becoming the first emperor captured alive by foreign enemies. Publius Licinius Valerianus represented the old Roman establishment, trying to govern during the crisis. He brought constitutional legitimacy and decades of administrative experience that previous soldier emperors had lacked. At age 60, his appointment reflected hopes that dignity and competence could overcome the empire's systemic problems through proper management rather than just military force. His smartest decision was appointing his son Gallienus as co-emperor to handle western frontiers while he concentrated on eastern threats, creating a rational division of impossible responsibilities. This power-sharing arrangement worked better than previous attempts because both rulers had clearly defined geographical areas rather than competing for the same territory. The defining disaster was his capture by Persian king Shapur I in 260 CE during negotiations following Roman defeat at the Battle of Edessa. Valerian became the first emperor taken prisoner by foreign enemies, suffering various humiliations, including allegedly being used as a human footstool by the Persian king before dying in captivity. Persian sources claim Shapur had the captured emperor skinned alive and his hide stuffed and displayed in a temple, though this might be propaganda designed to emphasize Roman humiliation. Regardless of the exact details, his capture represented an unprecedented blow to imperial prestige that would echo throughout the ancient world. Valerian's reign proved that traditional methods and constitutional legitimacy couldn't solve 3rd century problems when the fundamental issue was military weakness against increasingly organized enemies. His capture would leave his son Gallienus to face the empire's worst crisis alone, and things were about to get much worse.
From co-ruler to sole survivor, meet Emperor number 39, Gallienus. This innovative emperor ruled from 253 to 268 CE, initially sharing power with his father, until Valerian's capture left him alone to face the empire's complete disintegration while attempting revolutionary military reforms. Publius Licinius Egnatius Gallienus had initially governed the Western Empire, while his father handled Eastern threats, demonstrating genuine administrative competence during impossible circumstances. When news arrived of his father's capture by Persians, he became sole emperor of what was rapidly becoming a much smaller empire as provinces declared independence left and right. His revolutionary military reforms included creating mobile cavalry forces, recruiting Germanic tribes as federates, and promoting professional soldiers to senatorial rank regardless of their background. Innovations that modernized Roman warfare, but horrified traditional aristocrats who didn't appreciate barbarians getting fancy titles and social advancement. The catastrophic events of his reign included the Gallic Empire's independence under Postumus, Palmyra's Eastern Revolt under Odeodatus, and countless regional usurpations throughout the provinces. By 260 CE, Gallienus controlled little beyond Italy and parts of the Balkans, yet somehow maintained the fiction that he was still emperor of a unified Roman Empire. His death in 268 CE during the siege of Milan came through assassination by his own officers, including future emperor Claudius Gothicus, who blamed him for the empire's fragmentation, despite his innovative attempts to adapt to crisis realities. The conspiracy showed that even competent emperors weren't safe when the empire was falling apart around them. Gallienus had tried to revolutionize Roman military and political systems to meet unprecedented challenges, though his reforms came too late to prevent imperial disintegration. His death would bring Claudius Gothicus to power, and that general was about to show that sometimes what the empire needed was less innovation and more successful killing of barbarians. From conspiracy member to barbarian slayer, meet Emperor number 40, Claudius Gothicus. This Illyrian soldier ruled from 268 to 270 CE, earning his nickname through decisive victories against Gothic invasions, while beginning the empire's slow recovery from 3rd century chaos. Marcus Aurelius Claudius had participated in the conspiracy that killed Gallienus, representing military leaders who blamed the previous emperor for territorial losses and demanded more aggressive policies against external enemies. His provincial origins from the Balkans reflected the ongoing trend toward provincial leadership. Romans from the frontiers understood barbarian warfare better than aristocrats from Italian cities. His spectacular achievement was the decisive defeat of a massive Gothic confederation at the Battle of Nisus in 269 CE, where Roman forces destroyed an invasion force that ancient sources numbered at over 300,000 warriors. This victory ended Gothic pressure on the Danube frontier for years and began restoring Roman military prestige after decades of defeats. The military success came by combining traditional Roman discipline with innovative tactics using mobile cavalry forces, proving that Gallienus's military reforms could achieve results when properly implemented by competent commanders. Claudius showed that adapted Roman armies could still decisively defeat barbarian confederations when led effectively. His death from plague in 270 CE at Sirmium prevented him from completing the imperial restoration he'd begun, though his brief reign had proven that the empire could still achieve decisive military victories against external enemies when properly organized and commanded. Claudius Gothicus became the model for future Illyrian emperors who would complete Rome's recovery, demonstrating that provincial soldiers could save the empire through personal courage combined with practical military reforms, rather than just traditional methods or political theory.
Brief interlude of brotherly succession. Meet Emperor number 41, Quintillus. His brother of Claudius Gothicus ruled for about 17 days in 270 CE, representing the last attempt at family-based succession before the Illyrian emperors completely transformed imperial politics through merit-based selection. Marcus Aurelius Claudius Quintillus was proclaimed emperor by the Senate and some military units following his brother's death from plague, though his legitimacy was immediately challenged by other commanders who controlled larger armies and had better military reputations. His brief reign showed how meaningless dynastic claims had become when real power rested with whoever commanded the most soldiers. His ultra-brief time in power was entirely consumed by civil war against Aurelian, who'd been proclaimed emperor by Pannonian legions and was marching on Italy with veteran forces. Quintillus controlled Rome and senatorial approval, but lacked the military support necessary for survival during crisis periods when constitutional legitimacy meant nothing. His death in 270 CE came either through suicide when he realized his position was hopeless, or through assassination by troops who preferred joining Aurelian to facing certain defeat. Either way, his reign demonstrated that family connections meant nothing without superior military force during periods when armies determined political outcomes rather than whoever had better constitutional claims or senatorial approval.
From Illyrian soldier to restorer of the world, meet Emperor number 42, Aurelian.
This provincial general ruled from 270 to 275 CE, earning his magnificent title through military campaigns that reunified the fragmented empire and established the methods future emperors would use to complete Rome's recovery. Lucius Domitius Aurelianus came from the same Balkan military culture that had produced Claudius Gothicus, representing the new breed of provincial soldiers who would dominate imperial politics for the next century. His proclamation by Pannonian legions demonstrated how soldier loyalties determine succession. Constitutional procedures had become meaningless compared to military effectiveness. His extraordinary achievements included defeating Queen Zenobia and reconquering the breakaway Palmyrene Empire in the east, crushing the independent Gallic Empire under Tetricus in the west, and successfully defending Italy against Germanic invasions. By 274 CE, he'd restored imperial unity for the first time since the 260s fragmentation, an incredible accomplishment. The crowning moment was his traditional triumph in Rome, parading captured enemies, including Zenobia and Tetricus, before cheering crowds who hadn't witnessed imperial victory processions for decades. This ceremony symbolically restored Roman confidence and imperial prestige, while demonstrating that the empire could still defeat its enemies when properly led. His death in 275 CE came through assassination by Praetorian officers during his Eastern campaign, allegedly because he'd threatened to punish corruption in the military bureaucracy. Even successful emperors weren't safe from palace conspiracies when they challenged entrenched interests or tried to reform institutional problems. Aurelian had proven that energetic military leadership could restore imperial unity and territorial integrity through superior generalship and strategic thinking. His methods would become the template for completing Rome's recovery, though his death showed that political survival required more than just military success.
From military restoration to senatorial interlude, meet Emperor number 43, Tacitus. This elderly senator ruled from 275 to 276 CE, representing the Senate's brief attempt to reassert civilian control over imperial succession after Aurelian's assassination, which worked about as well as you'd expect. Marcus Claudius Tacitus was allegedly chosen by senators after a 6-month gap following Aurelian's death, though this story of senatorial selection was probably propaganda covering what was actually another military coup by different army factions. At 75, he was among the oldest people ever to become emperor, which should have been a warning sign about his prospects. His brief reign focused on continuing Aurelian's policies of territorial consolidation and military reform, though his advanced age made him completely dependent on subordinates for actual leadership. His appointment of family members to military commands suggested he was thinking dynastically, despite all the constitutional rhetoric about senatorial authority. His main military campaign was against Gothic and Allan invasions in Asia Minor, where his forces achieved some tactical successes that maintained momentum from Aurelian's restoration efforts.
However, his personal contribution was limited by physical weakness and complete lack of experience commanding armies in the field. His death in 276 CE during the Asian campaign was officially attributed to fever, though some sources suggested assassination by troops who wanted younger, more energetic leadership during ongoing military crises. Either way, his 6-month reign proved that age and constitutional legitimacy couldn't substitute for military credibility. Tacitus had demonstrated that the Senate's influence over imperial succession was purely ceremonial by this point. Real power belonged to armies, regardless of constitutional procedures. His death would bring another brief dynastic attempt, but the pattern was clear. Only military competence could sustain imperial authority.
Brief attempt at brotherly succession. Meet Emperor number 44, Florian. This half-brother of Tacitus ruled for about 88 days in 276 CE, trying to continue his relative's policies while facing immediate challenge from militarily superior rivals who had better armies and strategic positions. Marcus Annius Florianus was proclaimed emperor by armies in Asia Minor following Tacitus' death, representing another attempt at family-based succession during a period when military merit increasingly determined imperial survival. His relationship to the previous emperor provided some legitimacy, but absolutely no guarantee of broader military support. His ultra-brief reign was entirely consumed by civil war against Probus, who'd been proclaimed emperor by Egyptian and Syrian legions and commanded veteran forces with better equipment and strategic positioning. The competition demonstrated how quickly soldier loyalty shifted when multiple claimants offered different advantages to their supporters. His military position collapsed when his own troops began deserting to Probus, who offered better prospects for advancement and had a superior military reputation from successful Eastern campaigns. Florian's inability to maintain basic soldier loyalty during civil war proved that family connections meant nothing without demonstrated competence. His death in 276 CE came either through suicide or assassination by his own men, ending another attempt at fraternal succession after less than 3 months in power. His defeat showed that dynastic relationships had become completely meaningless without superior military force and strategic advantages. Florian's brief reign marked another step in imperial evolution toward purely military selection, where constitutional claims and family connections yielded entirely to battlefield effectiveness and soldier preference. His death would bring Probus to power, a competent general who understood what actually mattered for imperial survival.
From Eastern commander to imperial reformer, meet Emperor number 45, Probus. This Illyrian soldier ruled from 276 to 282 CE, continuing the empire's recovery through military campaigns and internal reforms, while making the fatal mistake of using armies for construction projects during peacetime. Marcus Aurelius Probus had commanded Eastern forces under previous emperors, building a military reputation that made him attractive to troops seeking effective leadership during continued external pressures. His proclamation by Syrian legions demonstrated how provincial armies now completely controlled imperial succession rather than any constitutional procedures. His remarkable achievements included suppressing rebellions in Gaul and Britain, defeating Germanic invasions across the Rhine, and implementing agricultural reforms that restored productivity in regions devastated by decades of warfare. He also pioneered settlement policies that integrated barbarian prisoners as farmers within the empire, rather than just enslaving them or killing them. The most controversial aspect of his reign was using soldiers for civilian construction projects during peacetime, building roads, draining swamps, and clearing forests, while maintaining military discipline and training. This policy kept armies occupied productively while improving imperial infrastructure, though it made him deeply unpopular with troops who preferred fighting to manual labor. His death in 282 CE came when soldiers at Sirmium murdered him during one of these construction projects, purportedly frustrated by being forced to dig ditches instead of fighting enemies. The mutiny was led by Carus, his Praetorian prefect, who was immediately proclaimed emperor by the same troops who just killed their previous commander. Probus had proven that imperial restoration required economic reconstruction and infrastructure development beyond just military victories. Though his death demonstrated that Roman soldiers remained fundamentally warriors who resented being treated like a labor force. His policies were sound, but his political instincts were terrible.
From Praetorian prefect to lightning victim, meet Emperor number 46, Carus. This experienced administrator ruled from 282 to 283 CE, achieving spectacular military success against Persia before meeting one of history's most unusual imperial deaths during the campaign that should have been his greatest triumph. Marcus Aurelius Carus had served as Probus's chief of staff before leading the mutiny that killed his boss, demonstrating how palace officials could still seize power through careful cultivation of soldier loyalty. His rise represented the continued dominance of military professionals over civilian politicians, though his administrative background made him more well-rounded than typical barracks emperors. His extraordinary achievement was successfully invading Mesopotamia and capturing the Persian capital Ctesiphon for the first time since Trajan's conquests nearly 2 centuries earlier. This victory restored Roman prestige in the East while bringing enormous wealth back to imperial coffers and proving that reformed Roman armies could still defeat traditional enemies decisively. The campaign's success was so complete that Persian resistance collapsed entirely, allowing Roman forces to advance deeper into enemy territory than any general since the early 2nd century. Carus had accomplished what Valerian, Gallienus, and others had failed to achieve through superior strategy, better logistics, and more effective army organization. His death in 283 CE was attributed to a lightning strike while campaigning beyond the Tigris River, though some people suspected assassination disguised as divine intervention. Whether natural disaster or human conspiracy, his sudden death ended the most successful Eastern campaign in decades, just when complete victory seemed within reach. Carus had proven that reformed Roman armies could still achieve spectacular victories against traditional enemies when properly led and supplied, though his mysterious death reminded everyone that imperial power remained precarious regardless of military success. His death would divide the empire between his two sons, and that division would create new problems.
From Western heir to Civil War casualty, meet Emperor number 47, Carinus. This son of Carus ruled the Western Empire from 283 to 285 CE, demonstrating genuine military competence before losing everything through civil war against his brother's successor and his own officer's betrayal. Marcus Aurelius Carinus and left to govern western provinces, while his father and brother campaigned in Persia, where he'd shown administrative skill and military competence by suppressing Gallic rebellions and maintaining frontier security. His position seemed secure until news arrived of both his father's mysterious death and his brother Numerian's suspicious demise in the east. His defining challenge was civil war against Diocletian, who'd been proclaimed emperor by Eastern armies following Numerian's death under questionable circumstances. The conflict represented another struggle between competing regional power bases, with Carinus controlling the wealthier western provinces, while Diocletian commanded the more militarized eastern forces. His military achievements during the Civil War were genuinely impressive. He defeated multiple usurpers in Britain and Gaul, while organizing effective resistance against Diocletian's invasion of his territory. The decisive Battle of the Margus in 285 CE initially favored Carinus, whose tactical skill nearly achieved victory despite facing strategic disadvantages. His death during the battle came not from enemy action, but through assassination by his own officers, who'd grown tired of his allegedly harsh leadership style and preferred accommodation with Diocletian to continued civil war. This betrayal cost him certain victory and control of the united empire. Carinus had demonstrated that military competence and administrative skill couldn't guarantee imperial survival when personal relationships with subordinates deteriorated beyond repair. His death would bring Diocletian to sole power, and that Eastern emperor was about to transform the Roman world more completely than anyone since Augustus. From Eastern heir to mysterious corpse, meet Emperor number 48, Numerian. This younger son of Carus briefly ruled Eastern armies in 284 CE before his suspicious death during the retreat from Persia launched another imperial succession crisis that would bring the most transformative emperor since Augustus to power. Marcus Aurelius Numerianus had accompanied his father's spectacularly successful Eastern campaign and inherited command of victorious armies following Carus's death by lightning strike. His position seemed strong, given the campaign's military success and the enormous wealth captured from Persian territories. But something went very wrong during the journey home.
His brief reign was consumed by organizing the complex Roman withdrawal from Mesopotamia, a logistical challenge requiring diplomatic skill to maintain Persian peace while transporting massive amounts of treasure and prisoners back to Roman territory. These responsibilities tested his administrative abilities during what should have been a victory celebration. The mysterious circumstances of his death during the retreat sparked immediate controversy. His body was discovered in his closed traveling litter after several days, with Praetorian prefect Aper claiming the emperor had been ill and avoiding public appearances to prevent panic among the troops who were deep in enemy territory. His death led directly to Diocletian's proclamation as emperor and Aper's immediate execution for allegedly murdering Numerian, though the evidence was purely circumstantial. Whether Aper was actually guilty or just a convenient scapegoat, his death eliminated the most obvious suspect while legitimizing Diocletian's rise to power through righteous vengeance. Numerian's reign demonstrated how quickly imperial fortunes could change, even during successful military campaigns. From commanding victorious armies to mysterious death within months, his suspicious demise would bring to power the man who would solve the 3rd century crisis through the most comprehensive government reforms in Roman history.
From mysterious succession to systematic revolution, meet Emperor number 49, Diocletian. This Dalmatian soldier became emperor at age 39 in 284 CE and ruled for 21 years until his voluntary retirement in 305 CE, transforming the Roman Empire through the most comprehensive administrative reforms in its entire history. Born with the name Diocles in a small Balkan town, he'd risen through military ranks to command the imperial bodyguard before being proclaimed emperor following Numerian's mysterious death. His first act was personally executing Praetorian prefect Aper for allegedly murdering the previous emperor, establishing his legitimacy through justice rather than just military force, a sign of the systematic thinking that would characterize his entire reign. His revolutionary achievements included creating the Tetrarchy system with 4 co-emperors, dividing the empire into manageable administrative districts, implementing comprehensive price controls, and launching the last great persecution of Christians. These weren't just policy changes. They represented complete reconstruction of imperial government to meet 3rd century realities. The masterstroke was his voluntary abdication in 305 CE, retiring to his palace at Split to grow vegetables while his succession system transferred power peacefully to designated heirs. No emperor had ever voluntarily given up absolute power, proving that even the most successful rulers could recognize when it was time to step aside and let institutions function. His retirement ended the crisis of the 3rd century and began what historians call the Late Empire, with new military, administrative, and economic systems that would govern Rome for the next 2 centuries. Diocletian had essentially refounded the empire through systematic innovation rather than just military conquest.
The former peasant from Dalmatia had proven that individual genius could solve seemingly impossible systemic problems when combined with practical experience and a willingness to abandon traditional methods for effective alternatives. His reign would be remembered as the moment Rome adapted to survive in a changed world.
Co-emperor in revolutionary partnership, meet Emperor number 50, Maximianus. This Pannonian soldier ruled the Western Empire from 286 to 305 CE as Diocletian's trusted colleague, implementing tetrarchy reforms while managing military crises that required constant personal leadership and battlefield presence. Marcus Aurelius Valerius Maximianus had been Diocletian's military subordinate before being elevated to Augustus of the West, representing the practical partnership that made the tetrarchy system actually work. His appointment demonstrated how personal loyalty and military competence could create stable power-sharing arrangements when both partners prioritized imperial survival over personal ambition. His remarkable military achievements included crushing the Bagaudae peasant revolt in Gaul, defeating multiple Germanic invasions across the Rhine, and conducting successful campaigns in North Africa against Moorish tribes. These victories established the security that allowed civilian reconstruction throughout the western provinces, while proving the tetrarchy could handle multiple simultaneous threats. The defining challenge was the Carosian Revolt in Britain, where a Roman admiral had declared independence and controlled the English Channel with superior naval forces. Maximianus's eventual reconquest of Britain demonstrated Roman ability to recover lost territories through patient strategic planning and coordinated military operations across multiple theaters. His abdication in 305 CE alongside Diocletian marked the successful conclusion of the First Tetrarchy, proving that voluntary retirement could work when both emperors trusted their institutional frameworks. However, his later attempt to return to power would destabilize the very system he'd helped create and demonstrate the dangers of imperial nostalgia. Maximianus had shown that the tetrarchy could function effectively when all participants prioritized imperial stability over personal desires. Although his post-retirement activities would prove that even successful systems depended more on individual character than institutional design.
From Caesar to Augustus, meet Emperor number 51, Constantius I Chlorus. This Illyrian soldier ruled as Caesar from 293 to 305 CE, and Augustus from 305 to 306 CE, completing the reconquest of Britain, while fathering the son who would transform the empire more dramatically than anyone since Augustus himself. Flavius Valerius Constantius had been appointed Caesar under Maximian after distinguishing himself through successful campaigns in Gaul and the siege of London that ended the Carausian Revolt. His military competence and administrative skill made him the obvious choice for promotion to Senior Augustus following Diocletian's retirement, representing the Tetrarchy's merit-based selection system working exactly as designed. His greatest achievement was the final conquest of Britain, eliminating the last major breakaway territory and restoring imperial unity throughout the western provinces. The campaign required innovative naval operations and diplomatic negotiations that demonstrated both military and political skills beyond just battlefield leadership. As Augustus, his brief reign focused on consolidating tetrarchy reforms while preparing for renewed Persian warfare in the east. His administrative policies strengthened provincial government and military recruitment systems, building on Diocletian's innovations to create more effective imperial institutions that could function during leadership transitions. His death at York in 306 CE, while preparing campaigns against Scottish tribes, led directly to his son Constantine's proclamation by British legions, beginning the dynastic conflicts that would ultimately destroy the tetrarchy system. This succession represented a return to hereditary rather than adoptive imperial selection, undermining the institutional principles Diocletian had established. Constantius Chlorus had demonstrated that the tetrarchy could produce competent rulers through systematic selection and training, though his death revealed how quickly military loyalties could revert to dynastic preferences when given the opportunity. His son would use that opportunity to reshape the entire ancient world.
From Caesar to Senior Augustus, meet Emperor number 52, Galerius. This former shepherd from Thrace ruled the Eastern Empire from 305 to 311 CE, implementing Diocletian's policies with particular enthusiasm for Christian persecution, before ultimately ending it through one of history's most dramatic deathbed conversions. Gaius Galerius Valerius Maximianus represented the continued elevation of provincial talent through imperial service, a peasant who'd risen through military ranks to become Diocletian Caesar in the East. His appointment showed how the Tetrarchy could identify and promote competent administrators, regardless of social background, though his personal commitment to traditional Roman religion would create lasting controversies. His military achievements included successful campaigns against Germanic tribes along the Danube and decisive victories over Persian forces that restored Roman control over Armenia and northern Mesopotamia. These eastern successes maintained imperial prestige while securing valuable territorial gains that helped fund continued military operations and administrative reforms. The defining aspect of his reign was implementing Christian persecution with systematic thoroughness, viewing Christianity as a fundamental threat to traditional Roman religious practices that maintained divine favor for the empire. His personal commitment to persecution exceeded even Diocletian's policies and created lasting resentment among Christian communities throughout the eastern provinces. His dramatic policy reversal came with the Edict of Toleration in 311 CE, issued while dying from a painful disease that he attributed to divine punishment for persecuting Christians. This deathbed conversion represented one of history's most significant religious policy changes and ended the last systematic imperial persecution of Christianity. His death in 311 CE marked the effective end of anti-Christian imperial policy and beginning of toleration that Constantine would expand into active support. Galerius had inadvertently facilitated Christianity's triumph by demonstrating that even the most determined persecution couldn't destroy the new religion.
From Caesar to Civil War victim, meet Emperor number 53, Severus II,
This loyal administrator ruled from 306 to 307 CE, attempting to maintain tetrarchy principles while facing dynastic rebellion that would ultimately destroy Diocletian's constitutional system and restore hereditary succession through military force. Flavius Valerius Severus had been promoted from Caesar to Augustus following Constantius Chlorus's death, representing the Tetrarchy's institutional succession mechanisms working as Diocletian had intended. His elevation demonstrated that merit-based selection could still function despite growing pressure for hereditary succession from military units that preferred familial dynastic claims to constitutional procedures. His fatal challenge was Maxentius's rebellion in Rome, where the old emperor Maximian's son had been proclaimed emperor by Praetorian guards and Roman citizens who resented being governed from distant provincial capitals. This revolt represented traditional Roman resistance to the administrative decentralization that had been essential for managing the empire's 3rd century crisis. His military campaign against Rome failed catastrophically when his own troops defected to Maxentius, apparently preferring service under a familiar dynasty rather than loyalty to abstract constitutional principles. These defections proved that soldier allegiance remained fundamentally personal rather than institutional, despite Diocletian's systematic reforms. His death in 307 CE came through execution after surrendering to Maxentius at Ravenna, ending another attempt to maintain tetrarchy legitimacy against dynastic rebellion. His defeat demonstrated that institutional innovations couldn't completely overcome traditional Roman preferences for familiar leadership during periods of political uncertainty. Severus II had represented the last serious attempt to maintain Diocletian's original constitutional system. Though his failure marked the beginning of dynastic civil wars that would restore hereditary succession through military victory rather than systematic appointment.
From excluded heir to Roman traditionalist, meet Emperor number 54, Maxentius. This son of Maximian ruled from 306 to 312 CE, attempting to restore Rome's status as imperial capital while fighting civil wars that would determine whether the empire remained traditionally pagan or became revolutionarily Christian. Marcus Aurelius Valerius Maxentius had been excluded from Tetrarchy succession despite his imperial pedigree, leading to his proclamation by Roman citizens and Praetorian guards who preferred familiar hereditary legitimacy to distant constitutional appointees. His rebellion represented traditional Roman resistance to the administrative decentralization that had reduced their city's political importance. His remarkable achievements included massive building programs that restored Rome's status as a magnificent capital, successful defense of Italy against multiple invasion attempts by legitimate Tetrarchy rulers, and policies that appealed to Roman nostalgia for traditional imperial government centered in the ancient capital rather than frontier military camps. The defining conflict was his war with Constantine, who invaded Italy in 312 CE, claiming divine Christian support against pagan usurpation. Their struggle represented more than just another civil war. It was fundamentally a battle between traditional Roman religious practices and revolutionary Christian innovation that would determine the empire's future character. His death at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, where he allegedly drowned while fleeing Constantine's forces, ended the last serious attempt to restore pagan imperial government based in Rome. His defeat marked Christianity's political triumph as much as Constantine's military victory, fundamentally transforming imperial identity. Maxentius had represented traditional Roman values and religious practices, fighting against the empire's transformation into a Christian monarchy, though his defeat ensured that innovation rather than tradition would define the empire's future development.
From tetrarchy appointment to Christian conflict, meet Emperor number 55, Licinius. This experienced administrator ruled from 308 to 324 CE, initially cooperating with Constantine before their partnership dissolved into religious civil war that would determine Christianity's role in imperial government. Valerius Licinianus Licinius had been appointed Augustus by Galerius to resolve succession crises following the collapse of Diocletian's original system, representing the last attempt to maintain multi-emperor government through institutional procedures rather than dynastic inheritance. His elevation showed that administrative competence could still influence imperial appointments during transitional periods. His early achievements included jointly issuing the Edict of Milan in 313 CE with Constantine, establishing Christian toleration throughout the empire, and successful campaigns against Gothic invasions that maintained Danubian frontier security. These policies represented effective cooperation between the two remaining Augusti and seemed to promise stable power-sharing arrangements. The partnership deteriorated over religious policy, as Constantine became increasingly committed to active Christian support, while Licinius maintained traditional religious neutrality. Their theological differences reflected broader imperial debates about Christianity's proper relationship to Roman government and whether the new religion should merely be tolerated or actively promoted. His defeat at the Battle of Chrysopolis in 324 CE ended divided imperial government forever, with Constantine emerging as sole emperor of a reunited empire. Despite promises of clemency, Licinius was executed the following year, eliminating potential future challenges to Constantine's revolutionary Christian monarchy. Licinius had represented the final attempt to maintain religious neutrality and administrative cooperation within Diocletian's reformed system, though his defeat ensured that imperial Christianity would become inseparably linked with monarchical government under Constantine's revolutionary new model.
From British usurper to Christian revolutionary, meet Emperor number 56, Constantine I. This game-changing ruler became emperor at age 34 in 306 CE and ruled for 31 years until his death at 65, transforming the Roman Empire more completely than anyone since Augustus through Christian conversion, administrative reform, and founding the city that would bear his name for over 1,000 years.
Flavius Valerius Aurelius Constantinus was proclaimed emperor by British legions following his father Constantius Chlorus's death, representing the return of hereditary succession despite tetrarchic constitutional procedures. His rise demonstrated how military loyalty to imperial families could override institutional innovations when opportunities arose, though Constantine would use that power to create changes far more revolutionary than anything Diocletian had imagined. His world-changing achievements included legalizing Christianity through the Edict of Milan, founding Constantinople as the new Rome on the site of ancient Byzantium, defeating all rivals to become sole emperor for the first time in decades, and establishing the gold solidus currency that would anchor imperial finances for centuries. These innovations transformed every aspect of Roman government and society. The defining moment was his victory at the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, allegedly achieved through divine Christian intervention after his famous vision of the Chi-Rho symbol and the message, "In this sign, conquer." Whether genuine religious experience or brilliant political calculation, his conversion fundamentally altered the trajectory of both Christianity and the Roman Empire. His death in 337 CE, near his new capital, marked the end of the most transformative reign since Augustus, leaving an empire that was Christian, administratively centralized, and economically stable, despite ongoing external pressures. His deathbed baptism confirmed the religious revolution he'd initiated 3 decades earlier. Constantine had proven that individual emperors could still reshape entire civilizations through personal vision combined with political skill, creating institutional changes that would endure for centuries and establish Christianity as the dominant force in European culture.
From designated heir to fraternal victim, meet Emperor number 57, Constantine II. This eldest son of Constantine the Great inherited the western provinces at age 21 in 337 CE and ruled for 3 years until his death at 24, proving that even careful succession planning couldn't prevent imperial siblings from fighting over territorial divisions. Flavius Claudius Constantinus had been groomed for power through military commands in Gaul and Britain, demonstrating competence in frontier warfare and provincial administration that suggested he could effectively continue his father's policies. His inheritance of the westernmost provinces represented Constantine's attempt to ensure stable dynastic transition through geographical division among his 3 surviving sons. His brief reign focused on implementing Christian policies while managing Germanic pressure along the Rhine frontier, showing continuity with his father's religious and military priorities. However, tensions with his brothers over territorial boundaries and authority created instability that undermined effective governance throughout the former unified empire. His fatal mistake was launching civil war against his brother Constans over control of disputed territories in Italy and the Balkans, representing the familiar pattern of imperial siblings fighting, despite careful constitutional arrangements. These dynastic disputes proved that family connections couldn't overcome personal ambitions for ultimate supremacy.
His death in 340 CE at the Battle of Aquileia, where his forces were crushed while invading his brother's territory, demonstrated how quickly imperial unity could collapse, even under apparently stable hereditary arrangements. His defeat left only two brothers competing for control of the reunified Western Empire. Constantine II had shown that successful imperial succession required more than just constitutional legitimacy and careful preparation. It needed either clear territorial boundaries or personal restraint that Constantine's sons lacked, despite their Christian education and their father's careful dynastic planning.
From youngest heir to Western survivor, meet Emperor number 58, Constans. This brother of Constantine II ruled from 337 to 350 CE, surviving fraternal civil war to govern the Western Empire before falling to military rebellion that ended the Constantinian dynastic experiment and proved that Christian emperors could be just as unpopular as pagan ones. Initially granted control of Italy, Africa, and Illyricum, while his older brothers governed other regions, Constans had proven his military competence by defeating Constantine II and absorbing his territories. At just 17 when he became emperor, and 20 when he eliminated his brother, this victory demonstrated that youth didn't necessarily mean weakness when it came to imperial power struggles. His genuine achievements included successful campaigns in Britain that restored frontier security after years of barbarian raids, effective defense against Germanic invasions along the Rhine, and continued support for Nicene Christianity that maintained his father's religious revolution. These accomplishments showed real imperial competence despite his relative youth. The controversial aspect of his reign was harsh treatment of pagans and Arian Christians, implementing religious policies with greater severity than Constantine had attempted. His religious intolerance alienated traditional Romans while creating theological conflicts that would destabilize imperial politics for decades, proving that Christian rulers could be just as tyrannical as their pagan predecessors. His death in 350 CE came during Magnentius's military rebellion in Gaul, where his own troops abandoned him for a usurper who promised better military leadership and religious moderation. Constans was killed while fleeing towards Spain, ending the Constantinian Western dynasty after just 13 years of increasingly unpopular rule. Constans had demonstrated that religious legitimacy couldn't substitute for military credibility and popular support during periods of external pressure and internal dissatisfaction. His death would bring his surviving brother, Constantius II, to sole power. But that Eastern emperor faced even greater challenges.
From Eastern survivor to theological emperor, meet Emperor number 59, Constantius II. This middle son of Constantine the Great ruled from 337 to 361 CE, outlasting both his brothers to become sole emperor while facing the greatest external military threats since the 3rd century crisis and spending enormous energy on Christian theological controversies. Flavius Julius Constantius had inherited the eastern provinces and immediately faced renewed Persian warfare under aggressive Sassanid King Shapur II, demonstrating that imperial succession brought no relief from the strategic challenges that required constant attention. His survival through decades of simultaneous internal and external conflicts showed remarkable political and military skill under impossible circumstances. His extraordinary military achievements included successful defense against Persian invasions that threatened Roman control of Armenia and Mesopotamia, innovative fortification systems that strengthened eastern frontiers, and eventual defeat of Western usurpers that restored imperial unity under dynastic control after years of civil war and territorial division. The defining challenge was the Persian siege of Nisibis, where Roman defenders held out for months against overwhelming odds, while Constantius organized relief operations and diplomatic initiatives. His strategic patience and tactical flexibility during these eastern campaigns demonstrated superior generalship compared to most emperors of the crisis centuries. His death in 361 CE, while marching west to confront his nephew Julian's rebellion, ended the last attempt at Constantinian dynastic government, though his 24-year reign had proven that competent imperial administration could still manage multiple simultaneous crises through careful resource allocation and strategic priority setting. Constantius II had demonstrated that Constantine's religious and administrative innovations could survive their creator's death, establishing Christian imperial government as a permanent feature of Roman civilization, despite ongoing theological controversies and relentless external military pressures.
From scholarly nephew to pagan restorer, meet Emperor number 60, Julian. This intellectual rebel became emperor at age 29 CE and ruled for less than 2 years until his death at 31, attempting to reverse his uncle Constantine's Christian revolution through philosophical paganism and military campaigns that ended in Persian disaster. Flavius Claudius Julianus was one of the few surviving members of Constantine's family after Constantius II's purges, appointed Caesar in Gaul, where his unexpected military success against Germanic invasions earned soldier loyalty despite his reputation as a bookish intellectual. His philosophical education made him unique among emperors, a genuine scholar who could also lead armies and win battles. His revolutionary policy was systematically dismantling Christian privileges while restoring traditional Roman religious practices, earning him the posthumous nickname Julian the Apostate from church historians who couldn't forgive his betrayal of family religious traditions. His reforms represented the last serious imperial attempt to reverse Christianity's triumph through government action. The defining campaign was his invasion of Persia in 363 CE, where initial tactical successes led to strategic overextension and eventual disaster when Persian forces cut Roman supply lines deep in enemy territory. His personal leadership during the desperate retreat demonstrated physical courage but questionable strategic judgment that put entire armies at risk. His death from a spear wound during a Persian skirmish ended both his pagan restoration and his military campaign, leaving Roman forces stranded in hostile territory without supplies or clear leadership.
His last words were allegedly, "You have conquered, Galilean," referring to Christ, though this was probably Christian propaganda, designed to show divine justice. Julian had proven that individual emperors could still attempt revolutionary religious changes, even against established institutional Christianity, though his failure demonstrated that some transformations were too complete to reverse through imperial decree alone.
From emergency appointment to Christian restorer, meet Emperor number 61, Jovian. This captain of the imperial bodyguard ruled for 8 months in 363-364 CE, negotiating Roman withdrawal from Persia while reversing Julian's anti-Christian policies and restoring religious arrangements that would define imperial government for centuries. Flavius Jovianus was hastily proclaimed emperor by troops stranded deep in Persian territory following Julian's death, representing military necessity rather than dynastic legitimacy or constitutional procedure. His selection demonstrated how crisis situations could elevate competent subordinates to supreme power when survival mattered more than political credentials or family connections. His crucial achievement was negotiating the humiliating but necessary Treaty of Nisibis with Persia, surrendering territorial gains and paying tribute in exchange for safe passage home for Julian's stranded armies. This diplomatic settlement prevented complete military disaster but significantly damaged imperial prestige and abandoned Roman allies to Persian vengeance. The religious restoration involved immediately ending Julian's pagan revival policies and restoring Christian privileges throughout the empire, demonstrating how quickly imperial religious policy could change based on individual emperor preferences. His actions proved that Christianity's institutional position had become essentially irreversible despite temporary setbacks under hostile rulers. His sudden death from accidental carbon monoxide poisoning in 364 CE while traveling through Anatolia ended another brief reign during ongoing succession instability that had characterized imperial politics since Constantine's death. His accidental death created yet another succession crisis, requiring immediate military resolution. Jovian had proven that emergency appointments could provide effective crisis leadership when survival was at stake, though his brief reign illustrated how individual imperial deaths could destabilize carefully negotiated diplomatic settlements during periods of external pressure and internal uncertainty.
From emergency election to systematic defender, meet Emperor number 62, Valentinian I. This Pannonian soldier became emperor at age 43 in 364 CE and ruled for 11 years until his death at 54, establishing the last successful imperial dynasty through military competence and systematic frontier fortification that would define late Roman defensive strategy. Flavius Valentinianus was elected emperor by military commanders following Jovian's accidental death, representing professional army officers taking direct control of imperial succession to ensure competent leadership during ongoing external crises. His selection demonstrated how military merit could still determine imperial appointment when the empire faced existential threats requiring immediate, effective response.
His remarkable achievements included systematic fortification of Rhine and Danube frontiers, innovative recruitment policies that expanded military manpower through barbarian integration, and administrative reforms that improved provincial government efficiency while maintaining central control. These defensive preparations created the fortified border systems that would protect the empire for generations. The defining characteristic of his reign was effective military leadership combined with religious tolerance, showing the controversies while focusing on practical defense requirements. His policies balanced Christian imperial identity with operational effectiveness, proving that pragmatic governance could transcend religious divisions. His establishment of dynastic succession through appointing his brother Valens as Eastern Emperor and later his son Gratian as Western heir represented the last successful attempt to create stable imperial transition through family appointment rather than adoption or military selection, though this success would prove temporary. His death in 375 CE from a stroke while campaigning against Germanic tribes marked the end of the most militarily effective reign since Constantine, leaving fortified frontiers and trained armies that would defend the empire through the coming barbarian invasions that would test every defensive system he'd created.
From brotherly appointment to catastrophic defeat, meet Emperor number 63, Valens. This Eastern Emperor ruled from 364 to 378 CE, governing competently for over a decade before suffering the most devastating Roman military disaster since Cannae in a battle that fundamentally altered the empire's relationship with barbarian peoples. Flavius Valens was appointed Eastern Emperor by his brother Valentinian I, representing successful power sharing between trusted family members who could coordinate policy across the divided empire. His administrative experience and military competence made him an effective ruler during normal circumstances, though the crisis that would define his reign was anything but normal. His genuine achievements included successful campaigns against Persian forces, fiscal reforms that strengthened Eastern finances, and effective management of theological controversies that had destabilized previous Eastern reigns. These accomplishments demonstrated real imperial competence over more than a decade of generally successful governance. The fatal crisis began with Gothic refugee requests for settlement within Roman territory, fleeing Hunnic invasions from beyond the Danube River. Valens' humanitarian decision to accept these barbarian settlers created unprecedented challenges when local Roman officials exploited and abused the desperate refugees, turning potential allies into dangerous enemies. His death at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, where Gothic forces destroyed 2/3 of the Eastern army and killed the emperor himself, represented the worst Roman military defeat in centuries. This catastrophe fundamentally changed the balance between empire and barbarians, establishing permanent barbarian settlement within imperial frontiers rather than temporary military service. Valens had demonstrated that competent administration couldn't overcome disastrous strategic decisions during crisis periods, while his death marked the beginning of a new phase where barbarian peoples would live within the empire as federates rather than being expelled or enslaved.
From teenage heir to religious revolutionary, meet Emperor number 64, Gratian. This son of Valentinian I became Western Emperor at just 16 in 375 CE and ruled for 8 years until his death at 24, implementing radical Christian policies that alienated traditional Roman supporters while facing military challenges that would reshape the empire forever. Flavius Gratianus inherited the Western Empire as a teenager, initially sharing power with his infant half-brother Valentinian II under their mother's regency. His early reign was dominated by the aftermath of Adrianople, where his uncle Valens's death had left the Eastern Empire in complete military and political chaos, requiring immediate Western intervention. His most controversial religious policies included rejecting the ancient title Pontifex Maximus and removing the altar of victory from the Senate House, symbolically ending imperial connection to traditional Roman religion. These actions pleased Christian supporters, but enraged pagan aristocrats who still dominated senatorial ranks and controlled significant wealth and influence. The defining crisis was his response to Adrianople disaster, where he appointed Theodosius I as Eastern Emperor and implemented new policies for managing barbarian settlement within imperial frontiers. These decisions represented strategic innovation during unprecedented military challenges, though they also marked the permanent end of traditional frontier policies. His death in 383 CE came during Magnus Maximus's rebellion in Britain, where his own troops abandoned him for a usurper who promised restoration of traditional military values and religious tolerance. Gratian was murdered while fleeing toward Italy, ending another attempt at stable Valentinian dynastic succession. Gratian had proven that religious innovation could be as politically dangerous as military incompetence when it alienated powerful traditional constituencies, while his death demonstrated that imperial survival required balancing Christian identity with practical military and aristocratic support systems.
From Spanish general to Christian lawgiver, meet Emperor number 65, Theodosius I. This last emperor to rule both East and West became Eastern Emperor at age 33 in 379 CE and ruled for 16 years until his death at 49. Making Christianity the empire's official religion, while rebuilding military strength after the Adrianople catastrophe. Flavius Theodosius was appointed Eastern Emperor by Gratian following Valens' death and the complete collapse of Eastern military power, representing recognition that the post-Adrianople crisis required experienced commanders rather than dynastic heirs or constitutional appointees. His Spanish origins continued the trend toward provincial leadership that had dominated imperial politics since the 3rd century. His extraordinary military achievements included rebuilding the Eastern Army through innovative recruitment and integration policies, negotiating effective treaties with Gothic federates that converted former enemies into allied troops, and personally leading successful campaigns that restored imperial control over devastated Balkan territories. The revolutionary religious legislation included the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 CE, making Nicene Christianity the empire's official religion,
systematic persecution of pagan practices throughout imperial territories, and closure of traditional temples that had functioned for centuries. These policies completed the Christian transformation that Constantine had begun generations earlier. His death in 395 CE marked the last time a single emperor would govern both eastern and western territories, as the empire was permanently divided between his sons Arcadius and Honorius. This partition represented recognition that imperial administration had become too complex for unified control under existing governmental systems. Theodosius I had proven that energetic leadership could overcome even catastrophic military defeats while establishing Christianity as the fundamental basis of imperial law and culture for the remainder of Roman history, though his death would begin the final phase of Western imperial decline.
From infant heir to adolescent victim, meet Emperor number 66, Valentinian II. This youngest son of Valentinian I ruled the Western Empire from age 4 in 375 CE until his suspicious death at 21 in 392, spending his entire reign under regency government while religious and military conflicts tore the Western Empire apart. Flavius Valentinianus was proclaimed emperor as a small child following his father's death, ruling under the regency of his Arian mother Justina, who struggled to maintain imperial authority against both external barbarian pressure and internal Christian opposition led by powerful bishops like Ambrose of Milan. His reign was dominated by religious conflicts between his Arian family and Nicene Christians, demonstrating growing church independence from imperial control as bishops increasingly challenged imperial religious policies. These theological disputes reflected broader struggles over Christianity's proper relationship to imperial government and whether emperors could still control religious doctrine. The defining military crisis was Magnus Maximus's invasion of Italy, which forced the imperial court to flee to Thessalonica and seek eastern military support from Theodosius I. The successful counteroffensive that restored Western territorial integrity showed that imperial unity could still function during extreme emergencies. His death in 392 CE at age 21 was officially attributed to suicide, though many suspected assassination by his general Arbogast, who had effectively controlled imperial policy during the final years while the young emperor remained a powerless figurehead. His suspicious death created the succession crisis that would bring Theodosius west as sole ruler. Valentinian II had demonstrated the continuing problems with child emperors during crisis periods, when effective leadership required personal authority and military credibility, while his death marked the effective end of Western dynastic government and beginning of barbarian generals' complete dominance over imperial policy.
From child emperor to scholarly bureaucrat, meet Emperor number 67, Theodosius II. This son of Arcadius became Eastern Emperor at just 7 years old in 402 CE and ruled for an incredible 48 years until his death at 50 in 450 CE. governing through ministers and family members, while the Eastern Empire developed the administrative systems that would preserve it for another 1,000 years. Flavius Theodosius II inherited the Eastern throne as a small child, ruling initially under Praetorian prefect Anthemius, and later his formidable sister Pulcheria, who effectively governed the empire while her brother focused on scholarly pursuits and religious ceremonies. His long reign represented the Eastern Empire's successful evolution into bureaucratic government that could function effectively regardless of imperial competence. His remarkable achievements included commissioning the Theodosian Code that systematized centuries of imperial law, constructing the massive land walls around Constantinople that would protect the capital for a millennium, and establishing diplomatic policies that managed barbarian threats through tribute and treaties rather than constant warfare. The defining challenge was managing the relationship with Attila the Hun, whose demands for tribute and territorial concessions drained Eastern resources while threatening imperial dignity. Theodosius's payments to Attila were strategically sound but politically humiliating, demonstrating how external pressure could force even powerful emperors into subordinate positions. His death in 450 CE from a riding accident ended the longest reign in later imperial history, leaving an Eastern Empire that was financially stable, administratively efficient, and militarily secure, despite ongoing external pressures. His succession would be determined by his sister Pulcheria, rather than through dynastic inheritance. Theodosius II had proven that competent ministers could govern effectively even under weak emperors, while his reign established the administrative and defensive systems that would allow the Eastern Empire to survive the Western collapse and continue for centuries as the Byzantine Empire.
From Western heir to powerless figurehead, meet Emperor number 68, Honorius. This son of Theodosius I became Western Emperor at just 10 years old in 395 CE and ruled for 28 years until his death at 38 in 423. Presiding over the Western Empire's catastrophic territorial losses, while barbarian generals effectively controlled imperial policy. Flavius Honorius inherited an impossible situation. A Western Empire facing massive barbarian invasions, internal rebellions, and financial collapse, while being governed by a child who depended entirely on military strongmen like Stilicho for actual leadership. His reign would witness the permanent loss of Britain, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa to barbarian settlement and independent kingdoms. The most infamous events of his reign included Alaric's sack of Rome in 1010 CE, which shocked the civilized world and demonstrated that even the eternal city wasn't safe from barbarian attack. His alleged reaction, weeping for his pet chicken named Rome rather than the actual city, was probably invented by hostile historians, but it perfectly captured his reputation for being disconnected from reality. His administrative policies were largely defensive, maintaining imperial government in Italy and remaining Roman territories, while his generals handled military crises that required constant attention. These policies represented realistic responses to impossible strategic challenges that no individual ruler could have solved through personal competence alone. His death in 423 CE from natural causes ended the Theodosian dynasty in the West, creating a succession crisis that brought further instability during the empire's final decades.
His reign had demonstrated that individual emperors mattered less than systemic problems during periods of imperial decline, while his death accelerated the process of Western territorial disintegration that would culminate in the empire's formal end within a generation.
From barbarian fighting general to brief emperor, meet Emperor number 69, Constantius III. This military strongman became co-emperor at age 52 in 421 CE after decades of effectively ruling the Western Empire as its top general, but died just 7 months later, before he could implement his plans for imperial recovery. Flavius Constantius had served Honorius loyally for over 20 years, defeating usurpers and barbarian invaders while essentially governing the Western Empire as its military commander-in-chief. His elevation to co-emperor represented formal recognition of political reality. He'd been the real ruler for decades, while Honorius remained a ceremonial figurehead. His remarkable military achievements included defeating Constantine III's rebellion in Gaul, suppressing Jovinus's usurpation in the Rhine region, and negotiating territorial settlements with Visigothic federates that maintained some Roman control over southwestern Gaul and parts of Spain. These limited successes showed that competent leadership could still achieve partial recovery, even during the empire's decline. His brief reign as Augustus focused on administrative and military reforms designed to strengthen imperial finances and recruitment systems, showing practical understanding of the Western Empire's fundamental problems. His policies represented realistic attempts to manage decline through better organization rather than unrealistic dreams of complete restoration. His death in 421 CE from natural causes eliminated the most competent Western leader since Stilicho, leaving Honorius without effective military support during the final phase of imperial disintegration. His loss accelerated the Western Empire's territorial collapse and administrative breakdown throughout the remaining provinces. Constantius III had proven that individual military competence could provide temporary stability even during the empire's decline, though his death demonstrated how dependent the late Western Empire had become on personal leadership rather than institutional strength or systematic solutions to its fundamental problems.
From civil servant to desperate usurper, meet Emperor number 70, Joannes. This senior bureaucrat ruled the Western Empire from 423 to 425 CE, representing the imperial administration's attempt to govern independently after Honorius's death, before Eastern intervention ended his brief experiment in bureaucratic rule. Joannes was a high-ranking civil servant who was proclaimed emperor by Western officials following Honorius's death, representing administrative continuity rather than military coup or dynastic succession. His elevation demonstrated how the imperial bureaucracy could attempt to maintain government functions even without constitutional legitimacy or military backing from the Eastern Empire. His brief reign focused on preserving what remained of Western imperial administration, while seeking diplomatic recognition from Constantinople, showing realistic understanding that Western independence was impossible without Eastern support or at least neutrality. His policies represented the last attempt at purely civilian imperial government.
The fatal challenge came when Theodosius II supported the child Valentianus III's dynastic claims, leading to Eastern military intervention under generals Ardaburius and Aspar. Joannes lacked sufficient military strength to resist this invasion, demonstrating how completely the Western Empire had become dependent on Eastern support for political stability. His death in 425 CE came through execution after his capture by Eastern forces, ending the brief attempt at bureaucratic independence. His defeat restored nominal Theodosian control over the Western Empire, though real power would continue to rest with barbarian generals rather than constitutional emperors or civilian administrators. Joannes had demonstrated that administrative competence alone couldn't sustain imperial authority without military strength or dynastic legitimacy, while his failure showed the West's complete dependence on Eastern intervention for maintaining even the appearance of unified imperial government.
From child restoration to imperial collapse, meet Emperor number 71, Valentinian III. This great-nephew of Honorius became Western Emperor at just 6 years old in 425 CE and ruled for 30 years until his assassination at 36 in 455, presiding over the Western Empire's final territorial losses while his mother and generals exercised real power. Placidus Valentinianus was installed by Eastern armies as the last representative of the Theodosian dynasty, ruling initially under his mother Galla Placidia's regency and later under the military dominance of Aetius, who controlled Western policy for decades while the emperor remained largely powerless to influence major decisions. His reign witnessed the complete loss of North Africa to Vandal conquest, continued barbarian settlement throughout Gaul and Spain, and Attila's devastating Hun invasions that required desperate alliances with former enemies to prevent total Western destruction. These territorial losses represented the permanent end of effective Roman control over most of the former Western Empire. The most significant moment was Aetius's victory over Attila at the Battle of Chalons in 451 CE, where a coalition of Romans and barbarian federates defeated the Hun Confederation in one of history's most important battles. This represented the Western Empire's last major military victory, achieved through cooperation with the same barbarian tribes that were simultaneously conquering Roman territories. His death in 455 CE came when he personally murdered Aetius during a palace meeting, allegedly declaring, "I am rid of my master." His assassination of the empire's most competent general was immediately followed by his own murder by Aetius's supporters, ending both the emperor and his victim in a spectacular act of political stupidity. Valentinian III had proven that late imperial emperors could be more dangerous to their own empire than external enemies, while his reign demonstrated the complete breakdown of effective governance during the Western Empire's final generation before its formal collapse.
From senatorial conspiracy to Vandal victim, meet Emperor number 72, Petronius Maximus. This wealthy aristocrat seized power at age 61 in March 455 CE after orchestrating Valentinian III's assassination, but ruled for only 77 days before his own death during the chaos he'd helped create. Flavius Petronius Maximus represented the old Roman senatorial class, making one final grab for power, allegedly masterminding both Aetius's murder and Valentinian's subsequent assassination through carefully planned palace intrigue. His brief reign showed how traditional aristocratic wealth and connections could still influence imperial succession, at least temporarily. His desperate policies included trying to legitimize his rule by marrying Valentinian's widow and arranging his son's engagement to the late emperor's daughter, dynastic marriages that were supposed to provide constitutional continuity, but instead triggered the catastrophic Vandal invasion that would destroy both his reign and the city of Rome. The defining crisis came when Gaiseric's Vandal fleet approached Rome from North Africa, attracted by the political chaos and seeking revenge for the broken marriage alliance between his son and Valentinian's daughter. Petronius Maximus found himself completely unable to organize effective resistance against this sea-borne invasion. His death in May 455 CE came when Roman citizens murdered him during his attempted flight from the approaching Vandals, reportedly pelting him with stones as he tried to escape the city he was supposed to defend. His assassination by his own people demonstrated the complete collapse of imperial authority, when emperors prioritized personal survival over civic duty. Petronius Maximus had proven that traditional senatorial wealth and palace intrigue couldn't substitute for military competence during existential crises, while his death during Rome's third sack marked the effective end of meaningful imperial government in the Western territories. Have mercy on his soul, if he even has one. Whisper. Pay more attention to the audiobook version next time.
From Gallic aristocrat to barbarian puppet, meet Emperor number 73, Avitus. This provincial senator ruled from July 455 to October 456 CE, representing Visigothic attempts to control Western imperial succession through their preferred Roman clients, rather than allowing Eastern emperors to choose Western rulers. Eparchius Avitus was a Gallic aristocrat serving as Petronius Maximus's ambassador to the Visigothic court when news arrived of the emperor's death and Rome's sack by Vandals. King Theodoric II immediately proclaimed him emperor, demonstrating how barbarian kingdoms now directly controlled imperial appointments within their territorial spheres of influence. His reign controlled only southern Gaul and parts of Spain, representing the geographic reality that Roman emperors now governed whatever territories their barbarian allies permitted them to rule. His authority depended entirely on Visigothic military support rather than constitutional legitimacy, Eastern recognition, or popular acceptance. His attempt to assert independent authority by recruiting Germanic troops and marching on Italy led to immediate conflict with Ricimer, who commanded the remaining Roman military establishment and refused to accept barbarian-appointed emperors from peripheral provinces. This confrontation represented the collision between different concepts of imperial legitimacy. His death in 456 CE came after military defeat by Ricimer's forces, followed by forced abdication and subsequent murder, while attempting to return to his Gallic estates. His elimination demonstrated that even barbarian support couldn't guarantee survival against the Italian military establishment that still controlled some imperial resources. Avitus had proven that regional imperial appointments were impossible without broader military control,
while his brief reign illustrated how completely the Western Empire had fragmented into competing authorities, controlled by different barbarian confederations with conflicting interests and territorial ambitions.
From military competence to political murder, meet Emperor number 74, Majorian. This capable general ruled from 457 to 461 CE, representing the last serious attempt to restore effective Western imperial government through military reform and territorial recovery before his assassination ended hopes for imperial revival. Julius Valerius Majorianus had been appointed by the barbarian general Ricimer after Avitus's defeat, initially sharing power with his Germanic patron who controlled the Italian military establishment. His elevation represented hope that competent leadership could still achieve limited territorial recovery despite the Western Empire's catastrophic weakness and fragmentation. His extraordinary achievements included comprehensive military reforms that rebuilt Western armies, successful campaigns that recovered significant portions of Gaul from barbarian control, and administrative innovations that restored imperial finances through more efficient taxation and resource management. These accomplishments showed that effective government remained possible with proper leadership. The ambitious centerpiece of his restoration program was planning a massive naval expedition to reconquer Vandal North Africa, representing the most serious attempt at territorial recovery since the early 5th century. His strategy demonstrated realistic understanding of what imperial restoration would require, eliminating the Vandal threat that controlled the Mediterranean and raided Italian coasts at will. His death in 461 CE came through assassination by Ricimer's agents, who had grown suspicious of his independence and territorial ambitions. The murder occurred after the failed African expedition had weakened his political position, while his increasing autonomy threatened Ricimer's control over imperial policy and military appointments. Majorian had proven that individual competence and military reform could still achieve significant recovery, even during the empire's final phase, though his assassination demonstrated that barbarian power brokers wouldn't tolerate emperors who threatened their dominance over imperial institutions and territorial control. From Majorian's assassination to Ricimer's puppet, meet Emperor number 75, Libius Severus. This nobody senator ruled from 461 to 465 CE, becoming emperor at around 50 and spending 4 years as the perfect example of what happens when barbarian generals decide they want emperors who will shut up, sit still, and sign whatever papers get put in front of them. Libius Severus Serpentius was basically Ricimer's answer to the Majorian problem. After murdering an emperor who'd gotten too independent and competent for his own good, the barbarian kingmaker needed someone who understood that emperor was now just a fancy word for guy who wears purple while someone else makes all the decisions. This career senator had spent decades perfecting the art of being forgettable, which turned out to be exactly the qualification Ricimer was looking for. His achievements included having absolutely no control over military policy, zero influence on territorial decisions, and the remarkable ability to remain completely irrelevant while the Western Empire continued falling apart around him. The Eastern Emperor Leo I refused to even recognize his legitimacy, which was probably the most honest assessment anyone made of his reign. He was basically a very expensive rubber stamp with imperial pretensions. The guy's entire reign was spent watching Ricimer handle all the actual governing, while he presumably practiced looking imperial in mirrors and tried not to think about what had happened to his predecessor. His policies consisted mainly of agreeing with whatever Ricimer suggested and trying not to accidentally express any independent opinions that might get him killed. His death in 465 CE at age 54 was officially attributed to natural causes, though, given Ricimer's track record with emperors, natural causes probably meant naturally Ricimer got tired of him. His 4-year reign had proven that the position of Western Roman emperor had become completely ceremonial. Real power belonged to whoever commanded the armies. Libius Severus had demonstrated that survival as a late imperial emperor required the complete abandonment of any pretense to actual authority. His death would bring yet another experiment in finding someone willing to wear the crown. This time, the Eastern Empire would try sending their own candidate to see if outside appointment worked better than local puppet shows.
From Eastern intervention to Western disaster, meet Emperor number 76, Anthemius. This Byzantine aristocrat ruled from 467 to 472 CE, becoming emperor at around 50 when the Eastern Emperor Leo I decided to solve the Western puppet problem by sending his own candidate, which worked about as well as you'd expect when you try to impose foreign rulers on people who already hate being governed. Procopius Anthemius was Leo I's hand-picked solution to the Libius Severus embarrassment, representing the East's attempt to restore actual imperial government through competent appointment, rather than just letting Ricimer pick whatever senator seemed most compliant. His arrival in Italy came with Eastern military support and genuine administrative experience, plus the revolutionary idea that emperors should actually try to govern instead of just existing decoratively. His remarkable achievements included launching a massive joint Eastern-Western expedition against the Vandals in North Africa, negotiating with various barbarian kingdoms to stabilize territorial boundaries, and actually attempting to exercise real imperial authority despite Ricimer's obvious displeasure. The Vandal campaign was particularly ambitious, over 100,000 men and 1,000 ships, in what should have been the reconquest that restored Roman control over the Mediterranean. But everything went spectacularly wrong when the Vandal expedition failed catastrophically, burning through enormous resources while achieving absolutely nothing except proving that even coordinated Roman efforts couldn't overcome superior enemy tactics and weather. This military disaster destroyed his credibility while creating the financial crisis that would doom any hope of Western recovery. His death in 472 CE came when Ricimer's forces stormed Rome and captured him, leading to his execution after a brief siege that turned the capital into a battlefield. At around 55, he'd learned too late that Eastern backing meant nothing when your own military commander preferred puppet emperors to competent ones. Anthemius had proven that even genuine imperial competence and Eastern support couldn't overcome the fundamental problem that barbarian generals now controlled Western politics completely. His death would bring Ricimer's final attempt at emperor-making, though the kingmaker himself wouldn't live long enough to enjoy his victory.
From Ricimer's last choice to natural survivor, meet Emperor number 77, Olybrius. This senatorial aristocrat ruled for just 4 months in 472 CE, becoming emperor at around 55 through the bizarre coincidence of being everybody's compromise candidate when the Western Empire's last kingmaker finally ran out of energy for political murders. Anicius Olybrius had the unique qualification of being married to Valentinian III's daughter, Placidia, giving him actual dynastic legitimacy that previous puppet emperors had completely lacked. Ricimer proclaimed him emperor immediately after murdering Anthemius, apparently deciding that family connections might work better than just picking random senators who promised to behave themselves during imperial ceremonies. His brief reign's most notable feature was presiding over Ricimer's death from natural causes just months after his appointment, creating the surreal situation where both the puppet emperor and his puppet master died within weeks of each other. This left the Western Empire without either ceremonial leadership or actual military control, which was probably an improvement over the previous arrangement. The defining irony of his time in power was that he finally achieved the imperial independence that had gotten his predecessors killed, but only because there was nobody left alive who cared enough to control him. His policies were presumably whatever seemed reasonable to a guy who suddenly found himself emperor of a collapsing state with no army, no money, and no clear successor to the barbarian general who'd been running everything. His death in November 472 CE from illness at around 56 meant he was the first emperor in decades to die peacefully in bed, rather than through assassination, civil war, or barbarian invasion. His 4-month reign had accomplished the remarkable feat of being completely uneventful during one of history's most chaotic periods. Olybrius had demonstrated that imperial survival was easiest when there was literally nobody left who wanted to control the emperor, though his natural death created yet another succession crisis. His passing would leave the empire in the hands of whoever could grab power first, and that turned out to be another barbarian general with his own ideas about puppet management.
From Burgundian puppet to peaceful retirement, meet Emperor number 78, Glycerius. This nephew of the previous emperor ruled from 473 to 474 CE, becoming emperor at around 45, when the barbarian general Gundobad decided he wanted his own imperial figurehead after Ricimer's death had left the puppet emperor business temporarily unmanaged. Flavius Glycerius was proclaimed by Gundobad, the Burgundian general who'd inherited Ricimer's position as Western military commander, representing the continued pattern of barbarian officers appointing Roman aristocrats to provide constitutional legitimacy for decisions they'd already made. His family connection to Olybrius probably helped, though his main qualification was being available when Gundobad needed someone to wear purple robes during official ceremonies. His brief reign accomplished the impressive feat of being completely ignored by almost everyone who mattered, including the Eastern Emperor Zeno, who refused recognition and was already planning to send his own candidate to replace this latest barbarian appointment. The Western Empire had become so irrelevant that different factions could proclaim competing emperors without anyone bothering to fight about it. The defining moment came when Julius Nepos arrived from the east with military backing, forcing Glycerius to abdicate, without any of the dramatic violence that had characterized previous imperial transitions. This peaceful transfer of power was probably the most civilized political event in the Western Empire for decades, though it mainly reflected how little the imperial title actually meant anymore. His remarkably gentle fate after deposition involved being appointed Bishop of Salona in Dalmatia, where he lived quietly for decades while his former empire completely collapsed around him. At around 46, when he lost the throne, he had achieved the unique distinction of being the only late Western emperor to survive his reign and enjoy a comfortable retirement. Glycerius had proven that imperial obscurity was actually the safest career path during the empire's final phase, though his peaceful abdication would bring the last Eastern attempt to restore legitimate government. His successor would discover that constitutional legitimacy still meant nothing when you couldn't control your own generals.
From Eastern legitimacy to Dalmatian exile, meet Emperor number 79, Julius Nepos. This nephew of a powerful general ruled from 474 to 475 CE in Italy, while continuing to claim the imperial title until his assassination in 480, representing the last serious attempt to restore constitutional government before the final collapse into pure military dictatorship. Flavius Julius Nepos was appointed by Eastern Emperor Zeno as the legitimate Western ruler, arriving with enough military backing to force Glycerius's peaceful abdication, while representing genuine hope that Eastern intervention could still restore effective imperial administration. At around 45, he brought both constitutional legitimacy and family connections to powerful military commanders who might actually support imperial authority. His most significant achievement was briefly restoring some semblance of actual imperial government in Italy, negotiating with various barbarian kingdoms while attempting to rebuild the administrative structures that had been completely neglected during decades of puppet rule. For about a year, it looked like competent leadership backed by Eastern support might actually stabilize the Western Empire's final territories. But everything collapsed when his own general, Orestes, rebelled in 475 CE, forcing Nepos to flee Italy for his family estates in Dalmatia, while Orestes installed his young son, Romulus Augustulus, as the new puppet emperor. This betrayal demonstrated that even Eastern backing and constitutional legitimacy meant nothing when your own military commanders decided they preferred their own family members wearing imperial purple. His assassination in 480 CE at around 50, while still claiming the imperial title in Dalmatia, officially ended any pretense that legitimate government could be restored through proper constitutional procedures. His death came 5 years after losing Italy, proving that being the real emperor meant nothing when you controlled no territory and commanded no armies. Julius Nepos had represented the final attempt to restore traditional imperial legitimacy through Eastern appointment and constitutional procedure, though his exile would leave the field clear for the ultimate puppet emperor. His overthrow brought to power a child whose reign would accidentally become history's most famous ending.
From child figurehead to history's end, meet our final emperor number 80, Romulus Augustulus. This 12-year-old boy became Western emperor in October 475 CE and was deposed in September 476 CE, earning the dubious distinction of being the last Western Roman emperor through the simple accident of ruling when the final collapse finally occurred. Flavius Romulus Augustus was proclaimed emperor by his father Orestes, who had rebelled against Julius Nepos and needed a legitimate figurehead to justify his military coup. His original name, Romulus, ironically recalled Rome's legendary founder, while the diminutive Augustulus, Little Augustus, perfectly captured his powerless position as a child puppet in adult political games. His brief reign represented the complete triumph of barbarian control over Roman institutions, with Germanic federates commanding all military forces while traditional administrative structures maintained purely ceremonial functions. The empire had become a constitutional fiction, preserved for diplomatic convenience rather for actual governance over meaningful territories. The end came in September 476 CE, when Odoacer, leading Germanic troops demanding land grants in Italy, deposed the child emperor and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. This action formally ended Western imperial government, though effective Roman control had been lost decades earlier to barbarian kingdoms throughout the former provinces. His fate after deposition was remarkably gentle for such dramatic historical circumstances. Odoacer granted him a pension and allowed retirement to a villa in Campania, where he disappeared from historical records entirely.
The last Western emperor thus avoided the violent death that had claimed most of his predecessors. Romulus Augustulus had the unique distinction of ending what Augustus had begun over 5 centuries earlier, though the collapse was inevitable regardless of who held the meaningless title during those final months. His deposition marked the formal conclusion of the Western Roman Empire, though the Eastern Empire would continue as Byzantium for another 1,000 years.
Phew! There you have it. Every single piece of history about the 80 Roman emperors. If you made it through all 80 of these lunatics, drop a comment about which emperor you'd least want as your boss, smash that subscribe button, and remember, absolute power corrupts absolutely, but it makes for fantastic entertainment. And that's the end of our imperial story. From Augustus building the greatest empire in history to little Romulus getting a nice retirement package from his barbarian replacements. Not bad for 503 years of mostly winging it. Look, we've learned that running an empire is basically impossible. Half these emperors got murdered by people they trusted, a quarter went completely nuts with power, and the rest were just trying not to get killed long enough to fix the roads. We had philosopher emperors who couldn't handle real-world problems, military geniuses who couldn't handle politics, and politicians who couldn't handle barbarians showing up uninvited. The Western Empire didn't collapse in some epic final battle. It was more like a really slow-motion car crash where everyone could see it coming, but nobody could figure out how to hit the brakes. By the end, Germanic tribes were basically doing all the work anyway, so they just took over management. But here's the thing. Roman ideas about how to organize society, build stuff that lasts, and create laws that make sense, that never died. It just moved to Constantinople and spread everywhere else too. These 80 crazy people accidentally created the foundation of Western civilization.